Night gathers over old stones, and Rome breathes a quiet prayer. Candles tremble in long halls, keys rest in guarded locks. Some whispered that a door beneath the basilica opens only when the moon leans low, and that beyond it lies a chamber where history chose a different face. There were those who wondered why certain names faded like smoke, and why some stories slept behind velvet and gold. Listen, hear the echo of soft sandals, the hush of a turning page, the rustle of robes like wings. In this peaceful dark, a map unfolds, not of streets, but of secrets. It begins with a question and ends in a deeper silence. Power stands beside faith, neither speaking, both listening. You are safe here. Breathe slow. Let the night hold you. We will follow the faint thread through hidden stairs and a quiet archive where dust glows like stars. If we move gently, the walls will remember. If we speak softly, the past will answer. Some whispered that the city keeps two clocks, one for the living and one for what the living forget. In the small hours, when bells fall into sleep and pigeons tuck their heads under silver wings, Rome opens her second clock and lets the old minutes walk. We begin there, at the edge of a courtyard where water murmurs and the air smells faintly of wax and marble. A single lamp burns in an upper window. There were those who wondered why it never goes out. Perhaps a scribe sits behind that glow, turning thin pages with careful hands, copying not what the world must know, but what the world must bear in silence. Do not hurry. This is a gentle road. Power is loud in the daytime, but at night it learns to whisper. We will hear of locked drawers, of letters that traveled by moonlight, of small quiet choices that shaped great tides. We will walk soft corridors where paintings watch like patient elders, and we will pause beside doors that warm to the touch, as if remembering the palms of many keepers. If fear rises, let it pass like a cloud. Our purpose is not to judge, but to witness. Faith and mystery have always shared a room. They breathe the same air. Some secrets protect what is fragile. Some are walls. Some are windows. We will learn the difference. With each chapter, we descend a step. From domes to crypts, from records to rumors, from rumors to rooms you can almost feel under your hand. Along the way, we will meet gentle figures, an old archivist with ink-blue fingers, a guard who hums psalms, a novice who listens more than he speaks. They will not tell us everything. They will tell us enough. Now breathe. The lamp is steady. The night is kind. The key is turning. Some whispered that there was always a single light burning in the great stone heart of the Vatican. Not the sun that kissed the marble at midday, nor the braziers lit for ceremony, but a lone, steady lamp that never faltered. It was said to rest high in a narrow window, glowing softly, like a patient star above the sleeping courtyards. There were those who wondered if the lamp was tended by a watchful soul, or if it burned of its own accord, fueled by something deeper than oil and flame. The night settled slowly over Rome, laying velvet shadows across bridges and domes. Pigeons folded their wings, fountains whispered in marble mouths, and the city sank into silence. Yet within the walls of the Vatican, the lamp glowed on, silent and constant, as though refusing the command of darkness. Some said it marked a room of records that never closed. Others claimed it was the watchlight of an unseen guardian, ensuring that certain truths remained forever hidden. A corridor stretched beneath that glowing window, lined with tapestries whose colors had dimmed with centuries. If one walked there in silence, the air itself felt alive with memory, heavy with breath not one's own. The faint smell of candle wax and ancient leather hovered, as though thousands of forgotten prayers still clung to the walls. The footsteps of the day had long faded, leaving only the echo of possibility. Some whispered that if you stood beneath the lamp and closed your eyes, you would hear faint pages turning. Though no one was near, the sound was soft, steady, like the pulse of history itself. And if you listened longer, you might sense words spoken not in Latin, nor any tongue of men, but in the hushed language of secrecy, where truths and doubts wove together like threads of a hidden tapestry. The light above was gentle, never glaring, never dimming. To see it was to feel watched and yet strangely comforted. Some wondered if the lamp burned not for the keepers within, but for the souls outside, those who sought answers they could not name. A beacon of questions, it remained steady through rain and storm, through bells of mourning and hymns of celebration, always there, always silent. Beneath it, a small door rested, unmarked, unadorned, its wood darkened by centuries of hands, though none seemed to linger there long. Those who passed by quickened their pace, as though an unseen presence urged them forward. Some whispered that the door opened only when the hour was neither day nor night, when the world was caught in breath between moments. Then, and only then, would the lamp's glow spill downward, a golden river across stone, leading the way to corridors unknown. If you stood long enough in that quiet passage, your heartbeat slowed to match the rhythm of silence. The walls pressed in, not with menace, but with a strange tenderness, as though urging you to surrender worry, to release thought, to simply be. And in that stillness, you might feel the stirrings of truth, not in the mind, but in the soul. A truth too vast for words, carried instead in the soft hum of the eternal lamp. For night had fallen, but the light remained. And somewhere behind that window, the Vatican kept its vigil, not for the eyes of the many, but for the silence of the few. There were those who wondered why the smallest gate in the wall was the one most heavily watched. It bore no crest, no ornament, only iron blackened by time. Yet, as vespers faded into the hush of night, guards stood there with reverent silence, their halberds catching the last flame of the setting sun. Some whispered it was the gate for shadows, where arrivals came not to be seen, but to be forgotten. When the bells stilled and prayers dissolved into the deepening dusk, the gate breathed softly. Its hinges creaked like a sigh, and through it passed not processions, but single figures cloaked in the ordinary. A priest with eyes lowered, a courier carrying nothing but a folded cloth. Sometimes only the scent of frankincense drifted through, as though the air itself had been carried inside. The cobbles before the gate wore smooth from centuries of steps, yet no one lingered there. The city outside grew dim, but within, a narrow path curved inward like a beckoning finger. Torches lined its way, but faintly, their flames whispering more than showing. It was a passage meant not for ceremony, but for surrender, a way into silence. Some said that the gate was called the Gate of Listening, that before entering, one must pause, press a hand to the cold iron, and breathe a single word, never to be repeated. A word not of command, but of offering. The gate remembered those words. It held them like secrets in its heavy bones. There were those who claimed that, on certain nights, if you pressed your ear to the gate, you would hear a low murmur, not of men, but of the walls themselves. The Vatican spoke here, softly, telling of burdens carried, of oaths unbroken, of truths that bent but never shattered. And as the last light of evening faded, the iron grew warm, as though listening back. To pass through was to step into a silence deeper than night, It was the silence of marble watching, of archives breathing, of shadows that welcomed rather than threatened. Within that quiet, one felt small but not diminished, like a candle before an endless sky. The quiet gate did not invite questions. It asked only patience. Some whispered it was the first test, that only those willing to be still, to listen, could walk its path unhindered. And so, as the world outside surrendered to the lull of night, the gate stood, hushed and waiting, a threshold into mystery. The corridors within breathed with marble, white, veined, worn smooth by centuries of feet and fingers. Each pillar stood like a patient witness, tall and silent, holding not only weight, but memory. There were those who wondered if stone could feel, for here, in these sacred halls, the marble seemed alive, its chill surface whispering of all it had seen. Some whispered that if you pressed your palm to a column long enough, the marble would grow warm, echoing the touch of countless pilgrims before you. Others said that in the still hours of night, faint impressions rose in its veins, faces, gestures, fleeting shadows, like the stone itself tried to recall what it had once absorbed. The echo of footsteps carried differently here. They did not scatter, but folded back upon themselves, hushed by the high arches above. Every sound seemed both close and far, as though the past walked beside the present, matching pace. If you slowed your breathing, you might hear more than echoes. A choir faint in the distance, the rustle of robes, the sigh of a candle extinguished long ago. There were those who claimed the marble had memory deeper than ink, that when scrolls burned and ledgers faded, the walls still held the truth. A touch here, a whisper there, and whole stories returned, softer than a dream. The stone did not judge, it simply remembered. Beneath certain archways, the air thickened, rich with incense sunk deep into pores over centuries. Light bent differently, softened, as though even the sun bowed in reverence. In these places, one felt the weight of invisible eyes, not menacing, but watchful, protective. And always, the marble guided. Its veins curled like rivers on maps, leading deeper into corridors where silence pooled thick and sweet. Those who dared to wander at night spoke of walking not alone, but with the companionship of the walls themselves, gentle presences, ancient and immense. Some whispered that the marble prayed with those who prayed, wept with those who wept, and carried every secret like a trusted confidant. It did not forget. It did not release. It only held, endlessly, until time itself grew still. And so, through marble that remembered, the Vatican whispered its past, not in words, but in the hush of stone that never sleeps. Some whispered that beneath the Vatican's highest vaults, there dwelled a keeper whose hands bore the stains of centuries. Not from sin, nor from candle soot, but from ink. Ink so dark, it turned his fingertips a deep and lasting blue. There were those who wondered if the color had seeped into his skin, or if it had flowed into his very blood, turning him into a living page of the church's hidden chronicle. In the hush of midnight, when courtyards lay asleep and bells rested their voices, the archivist moved silently among his endless shelves. The archives stretched like a labyrinth without end, corridors lined with cabinets that breathed dust and leather. No lantern was needed, for the man walked by memory, tracing each step as though guided by the very veins of the marble beneath him. He touched spines as one might touch the beads of a rosary, fingers whispering over bindings cracked by time. The ink upon his hands glimmered faintly in the half-light, as though the words he had written lingered there, glowing softly, unwilling to be lost. Some said he did not sleep, that when the world surrendered to rest, he continued his slow, patient work, writing into ledgers no one would see. The ink stained deeper with every passing year, until no soap could erase it. There were those who wondered if the words themselves had chosen him, refusing to leave his body, as though the secrets of the Vatican required a vessel more permanent than paper. When he wrote, his quill moved not with haste, but with reverence. Each letter curved like a prayer, each line breathed like a psalm. There was music in his script, a rhythm that lulled even silence into deeper rest. The sound of pen on parchment was gentle, steady, like the heartbeat of the archives themselves. Visitors seldom found him. Few even tried, for the archives had a way of confusing steps, of turning corridors back upon themselves. But some whispered that those who entered with humility, those who walked slowly, breathing with patience, might stumble upon the archivist in a small chamber lit by a single candle. He would look up, his eyes pale as parchment, his fingertips glowing blue in the flicker. He seldom spoke, but when he did, his voice was low, carrying the weight of both blessing and warning. There were those who said he held two ledgers, one bound in plain leather, filled with the names of kings, councils, and decrees. The other, older still, was covered in cloth faded to grey, its pages filled not with names, but with silences. This second ledger was said to record not what was done, but what was left unsaid, truths that lived between the lines of history. When his ink-blue fingers touched it, the candle flame seemed to waver, as though reluctant to witness what he inscribed. The archivist guarded more than memory. He carried the burden of discernment. What to preserve, what to conceal, what to let dissolve into ash. Some whispered that his ink was mixed with tears collected from the crypts, so that every word written carried the sorrow of those who had prayed in darkness. Others believed his ink was drawn from a well that never dried, a well said to connect the archives to deeper chambers where silence itself was distilled into liquid. If you ever found yourself in that chamber, he might not greet you with words. Instead, he would dip his quill, let it hover above parchment, and write your name, slowly, deliberately. And then he would look up with pale eyes and simply nod, as though acknowledging that you, too, had now become part of the record. For in his care, every soul who entered became ink, written not on pages, but on the memory of eternity. The archivist's fingers glowed blue until his last breath, and even then, they say the stains remained. Some wondered if he was buried, or if his body was placed within the archives themselves, a final volume bound in flesh and silence. And so, through him, the Vatican spoke softly, not with sermons, but with ink, with stains that no water could wash away, with secrets that lived in the veins of a man who was more parchment than flesh. There were those who wondered why the dust in the archives never settled as dust should. In ordinary places, dust lies heavy, waiting for the sweep of a cloth. But here, beneath the Vatican's ancient stones, it hung in the air like stars, each particle catching light as if it carried its own small flame. Some whispered that the dust was not dust at all, but fragments of prayers worn thin by centuries, words that had risen from lips, grown too heavy with longing, and fallen to the floor of the holy corridors. In the hush of night, when a lone candle flickered, these fragments drifted upward again, glowing faintly, mapping constellations only the heart could read. The archives at night were a cosmos unto themselves, rows of shelves stretched like galaxies, and each mote of dust floated like a star, suspended in a silence deeper than the heavens. If you walked gently, your breath alone stirred them, sending new constellations into being. And if you paused long enough, the dust would align into patterns, symbols half familiar, as though history itself rearranged to whisper forgotten truths. Some said the archivist with the ink-blue fingers could read those constellations. He would lift his pale eyes from parchment and gaze into the air, following the drifting lights as though reading scripture written in silence. There were those who claimed he saw prophecies in their formations, wars foretold in the swirl of a spiral, reconciliations in the curve of two motes touching, miracles in the sudden bright flare when dust caught flame. The constellations changed with every night, for the Vatican's secrets never ceased to shift. New prayers entered the walls, old sorrows lifted, and each breath reshaped the sky of dust. Those who dared to walk there after midnight often found themselves slowing, heads tilted upward, hearts quieted by the sight of galaxies forming and dissolving above their path. In certain chambers, the dust glowed brighter, especially where the marble veins crossed, or where old manuscripts lay untouched for centuries. Some whispered that the dust remembered what pages had once said aloud, what secrets had been read in candlelight and then hidden away. And in remembering, it glowed. Tiny lanterns carrying fragments of long-forgotten voices. If you stretched out your hand, a mote might land softly upon your skin, trembling like a living spark. Some claimed it carried warmth, as though it remembered the fire of 1,000 candles. Others said it carried coolness, the chill of prayers whispered in despair. Whatever it was, it felt alive. And so the Vatican held its night sky not above but within, dust like constellations, stars born not of fire, but of words and silence, prayers and secrets, drifting eternally in the dark corridors. Some wondered if angels walked there too, unseen, stirring the motes into their shifting constellations, guiding the eyes of those patient enough to see. When dawn came, the dust stilled, falling back into invisibility, hiding once more upon stone and wood. But at night, in silence, it rose again. Constellations of memory, a sky of secrets, a galaxy only the archives could hold. There were those who whispered that not all letters reached their readers by daylight. Some travelled under softer wings, carried not by couriers on horseback, but by silence itself, moving only when the moon cast its silver gaze upon the earth. These letters were said to rest in the Vatican, bound in ribbon, their ink faded, yet still alive, trembling as though waiting to be read. They bore no addresses, no seals of kings, only simple folds. Some carried prayers written by trembling hands. Others bore confessions that never reached the ear of a priest. A few were said to carry instructions, quiet commands that changed the course of thrones and wars, delivered not in proclamation, but in shadows. By night, the archivist with ink-blue fingers would open a drawer carved from cedar, releasing a fragrance of age and secrecy. Inside, the moonlight seemed to pool, gathering upon folded parchment, as though the letters themselves drew in the silver light. He would take one, hold it beneath the glow, and read words meant for no eyes but his. His lips never moved, yet those who passed near swore they heard faint whispers, as if the letters read themselves aloud in voices not of this world. Some claimed the letters could not be destroyed, that fire rejected them, water only deepened their ink, for they were bound not by parchment, but by intention, written with hearts so heavy or so fervent that the universe itself agreed to preserve them. There were those who wondered if these letters were answered, perhaps not in ink nor in words, but in the turning of tides, the rising of stars, the sudden change of fortune in a far-off land. A king might waver, a council might soften, a war might pause, all because of words written in secrecy, carried by moonlight and hidden in cedar drawers. Some whispered that if you placed your hand upon such a letter, You could feel its pulse, a slow, steady thrum, as though the parchment carried within it the heart of the one who wrote it. And if you closed your eyes, you might even hear their breath, faint across centuries, a sigh of longing, a cry of regret, a prayer unanswered. Not all letters spoke of sorrow. Some carried love, love forbidden, love eternal, love wrapped in holy silence. These were said to glow brightest under the full moon, their ink shimmering like tears. The archivist never lingered long on these, for their voices were too human, too tender. He simply folded them gently, tied them with ribbon, and let the moonlight soothe their restless glow. And so the Vatican held letters that travelled by moonlight, whispers on parchment, bound by cedar and silence, living still in the archives. Some wondered if one night, when the lamp that never sleeps finally dims, those letters will rise together, unfolding their wings of parchment, and carry their secrets back into the stars from which they came. Some whispered that beneath the soaring voices of the choir, under the gilded arches where hymns floated like incense toward the heavens, there was a door no hymn could reach. It rested quietly in shadow, plain and unmarked, yet older than the marble that surrounded it. There were those who wondered if it had been placed there before the first stone of the basilica was ever laid, as though the building itself had grown around it, protecting what lay beyond. During daylight, when the choirs sang and their voices shimmered against the vaults, the door was nothing but wood, silent and still. But in the hush of midnight, when the last echoes of song had faded and silence curled into the rafters, the door seemed to breathe. Some said they heard faint murmurs rising from its seams, as though the music of centuries past still lingered within, unable to escape. The wood was dark, smooth, and strangely warm to the touch, even in winter's chill. Pilgrims sometimes wandered too close and pressed a palm against it, only to feel their hearts slow, their thoughts dissolve. Some claimed the door listened, that it drew in their secrets, their prayers, their doubts, swallowing them into its grain. The faithful crossed themselves quickly and hurried away, while the curious lingered, trembling at the thought of what they had given up. There were those who said the door opened only when the moon hung directly above the basilica, flooding the choir loft with pale light. Then, and only then, would the hinges stir. The sound was soft, not a creak, but a sigh, as though centuries of silence were exhaled in a single breath. Beyond lay a stairwell carved from stone, narrow and descending, the walls lined with grooves where countless hands had steadied themselves. Each step carried the weight of voices, prayers pressed into the rock like invisible carvings. The stair did not lead quickly. It spiraled slowly, as though testing the patience of the one who dared descend. Some whispered that each step required a breath spoken, not aloud, but in the heart. A word of reverence, a memory offered, a truth admitted. The stone listened. It remembered. It allowed passage only to those who carried nothing heavier than honesty. At the stair's end was a small chamber lit by no flame, yet it glowed faintly, as though moonlight had seeped through stone to rest there eternally. In the center stood an altar of simple design, its surface worn smooth by time. Upon it lay nothing, no book, no relic, no crown. And yet, those who reached the chamber swore they felt a presence more profound than any relic could summon. Some whispered that this was the true heart of the Vatican, not the grand basilica above, but this quiet hollow where silence was worshipped as sacred. The choir sang for the world, but here the world sang back in echoes only the soul could hear. Those who left the chamber never spoke of what they experienced. They returned to daylight with eyes that seemed older, quieter, as though carrying a secret too heavy for words. And so the door beneath the choir remained, waiting in shadow, swallowing secrets, exhaling silence. A reminder that beneath every hymn there is a hush, beneath every voice, a deeper stillness, and that sometimes the truest music is the one the world is not meant to hear. There were those who claimed that somewhere within the Vatican lay a stair that did not measure distance by steps, but by breaths. A narrow passage, hidden behind a veil of stone, descending in silence so profound it seemed to erase time itself. They called it the Stair of 99 Breaths, for it was said that to reach its end, one must surrender precisely that number, no more, no less. The entrance was unmarked, a dark slit in the marble that seemed too small to invite passage. Yet, once entered, the stair widened, spiraling downward with walls so close that shoulders brushed stone. The air was cool, still, and heavy with a scent of earth long undisturbed. Each step sank softly, as though the stair absorbed the sound, refusing to let echoes escape. Some whispered that the stair was not built, but grown, carved by unseen hands who shaped it from living rock. Its curves were perfect, its descent unbroken, as though designed by breath itself. And as you stepped upon it, your lungs slowed, compelled to follow its rhythm. The first breath filled you with quiet, the second with surrender. By the 10th, your thoughts began to dissolve, falling away like leaves from a branch. By the 30th, the boundary between body and stone blurred, your heartbeat aligned with the stair's slow pulse. Some said that by the 50th, you no longer descended by feet, but by spirit, carried downward as if cradled by the earth itself. There were those who wondered what happened if the breath count was lost. Did the stair end? Or did it extend endlessly, swallowing the one who miscounted? Few dared to test it, for the stair required trust, not calculation. It asked the pilgrim to surrender control, to breathe with faith that each exhale carried them closer to something unseen. At the 99th breath, the stair opened into a chamber of quiet light. The walls shimmered faintly, as though each exhalation had etched itself into stone. The chamber was empty, yet alive with presence, as though countless souls still lingered there, their breaths woven into eternity. Those who entered swore that in that moment, upon their final breath, they received a vision, not of angels with wings or saints in glory, but of themselves, seen with unbearable clarity. Some wept, some laughed, some fell silent forever. For the stair of 99 breaths did not lead to a place, but to a mirror hidden in the soul. And when they climbed back, the stair felt shorter, easier, as though the stone itself carried them upward, whispering, "You are lighter now. You are remembered." There were those who whispered of a room that listened more than it spoke. A chamber, hidden deep within the Vatican, reached only by corridors that curved strangely, leading you without logic, until you stumbled upon a door carved with no symbol at all. The room of unasked questions. It was said that anyone who entered felt an immediate weight upon the chest, not of fear, but of memory. The air was dense, fragrant with candle wax and parchment, yet it shimmered faintly as though filled with invisible wings. At the center stood a single wooden table, its surface scarred by centuries of elbows, fists, and trembling hands. Around it, chairs waited, though they never aged, their wood always warm, as though countless souls still occupied them. Some claimed the room was alive, that its very walls breathed, listening not to words spoken, but to those swallowed in silence. Every unasked question, Every doubt carried in secret found voice here. They rose from the heart unbidden, filling the air with whispers only the soul could hear. There were those who wondered why such a room existed. Was it a confessional for those too weary to confess? A sanctuary for truths too fragile to be spoken aloud? Or was it something deeper, a chamber where the Vatican itself gathered the doubts of the faithful, collecting them like seeds? Those who lingered long enough swore they felt the questions pressing close. Why must suffering exist? Why is power bound to faith? Why do prayers sometimes return unanswered? The walls held them gently, never rebuking, never resolving, only cradling the unspoken in silence. Some whispered that the archivist with ink-blue fingers sometimes entered, sitting alone at the table, his stained hands resting on the wood. He would close his eyes, and the room would thrum softly, as though recognizing a keeper of silence. Perhaps he recorded the questions, not in ink, but in memory. Perhaps he simply bore them away, letting them sink into the constellations of dust above the archives. No answers ever came from the room. Only quiet. Only the strange comfort of knowing that even what could not be spoken had been heard. And when the door closed behind you, the questions did not vanish. They simply rested, like candles left unlit, waiting for a flame that may or may not come. And so, the room of unasked questions remained. A sanctuary for silence, a chapel of doubt, a reminder that faith is not always certainty, but the courage to carry unanswered whispers into the dawn. Some whispered that deep within the Vatican lay a manuscript unlike any other, not because of what it contained, but because of what it lacked. A book without voice, they called it. Its pages were filled with markings that looked like letters, yet none belonged to any language known to man. The symbols curled and spiraled like smoke, sometimes forming shapes that resembled wings or flames, sometimes vanishing into lines too faint for the eye to follow. There were those who wondered if the book was written not to be read, but to be felt. For when the archivist with the ink-blue fingers laid his palm upon it, the candlelight in the chamber dimmed, and the air grew heavy, as though the silence itself leaned closer to listen. He would not turn the pages quickly, but with reverence, each movement of parchment like the turning of a season. Some said he did not read at all, but that the book read him. The chronicle without a voice was kept in a chest of cedar bound with iron. The lock bore no key, for the chest never truly closed. When one approached it with a restless mind, the lid felt immovable, as though welded shut by unseen hands. But when approached with calm and humility, the chest opened silently, revealing the manuscript resting as if asleep. Some claimed the book gave off a faint warmth, like the skin of something living. No scholar had ever deciphered the symbols. Linguists puzzled, mystics prayed, historians traced the curves with trembling fingers, but no meaning appeared. And yet, those who dared to sit in its presence found their hearts stirred by visions. A soldier once dreamed of laying down his sword. A widow felt her grief dissolve into light. A childless woman awoke with laughter, as if carrying an unseen promise within her. None could explain why, and none could deny it. Some whispered that the manuscript was not written in human letters, but in the language of silence itself, that the markings were merely shadows of sounds, too soft to be heard by mortal ears. Others believed it was the record of prayers, spoken by those who never had the chance to utter them aloud, an anthology of whispers from souls whose voices had been swallowed by time. The archivist never revealed what he knew. He turned the pages slowly, eyes pale and unblinking, sometimes pausing as though struck by a memory too distant to grasp. When he closed the manuscript, He would press his stained fingertips to the cover and breathe deeply, as though the silence itself exhaled into him. The chronicle, without a voice, remained unsolved, unread, yet unforgotten. Its power did not lie in meaning, but in presence. Those who sat before it found themselves stripped of noise, stripped of certainty, until only the pure ache of longing remained. And in that ache, they discovered truths no words could carry. Perhaps that was the secret, that some mysteries were never meant to be spoken, but only felt. Silent rivers flowing beneath the marble, waiting for the soul to listen. There were those who said that within a certain chapel, hidden far from the eyes of pilgrims, candles burned without ceasing. Not because they were tended, but because they refused to die. Their flames flickered endlessly, as though sustained not by wax, but by memory itself. And above them, resting in glass cases, lay crowns, heavy with gold, studded with jewels, yet dulled by centuries of quiet. The chamber was small, its ceiling low, its walls carved with prayers so faint they seemed more like sighs than script. The air was warm with the mingled scents of wax and incense, though no incense had been burned there in living memory. Some whispered that the candles drew their fuel from devotion long past, as though every kneeling soul who had ever entered had left behind a spark to keep them alive. The crowns were silent witnesses. They had once sat upon the heads of kings, popes, and emperors. Some had been carried through battles, others worn at coronations, others again offered at altars as tokens of power surrendered to faith. Now they rested untouched, guarded not by locks or guards, but by the silence of the room itself. For to touch them was to feel the unbearable weight of both glory and burden. There were those who wondered why the crowns and candles were kept together. What bond tied the flicker of humble flame to the cold gleam of royal metal? Some said it was to remind power of its fragility, that crowns may shine, but must bow to the flame. Others believed the candles represented the countless souls whose lives upheld the weight of each crown, unseen and unsung, burning quietly in service until they were gone. When one entered the chamber, the light was strange. The flames bent softly, casting halos upon the crowns, making jewels shimmer as if alive. Some whispered that the flames revealed what the eye could not see, that within the metal rested memories, the laughter of kings, the tears of queens, the prayers of rulers who trembled beneath their own authority. The archivist with the ink-blue fingers sometimes stood before the crowns, his gaze not upon the gold, but upon the flames. He would whisper something too faint to catch, and the flames would quiver, as though answering. Perhaps he asked forgiveness for those who had warned them. Perhaps he reminded the crowns that power was fleeting, but flame eternal. Visitors left the chamber in silence. They walked more slowly, their eyes softened, their breaths hushed. For the room carried no grandeur, no display of wealth, only a reminder that power and humility are bound together, as crown and candle, as gold and flame. And in the end, it is not the crown that endures, but the light it reflects. Some whispered of a boy who entered the Vatican, not with ambition, but with silence. He was no scholar, no nobleman's son, no prodigy of scripture. He was simply a novice who listened. While others hurried to impress with prayers or knowledge, he lingered at thresholds, head tilted, as though the walls themselves spoke to him. The elders first thought him slow, for he asked no questions and offered no answers. But they began to notice how birds landed near him in courtyards, how candles flickered toward him in chapels, how even the marble seemed less cold when he leaned against it. There were those who wondered if he heard what others could not, the breath of stone, the sigh of parchment, the hum of silence alive. At night, when others slept, he wandered softly through corridors, not in disobedience, but in wonder. He would pause before tapestries, listening as though fabric carried memory. He lingered by fountains, hearing more than water, and sometimes he stood beneath the lamp that never sleeps, eyes closed, lips parted, as though catching whispers too faint for the world. One evening, he found himself before the room of unasked questions. The door opened for him, though he had no key. Inside, the air throbbed with silence, heavy with doubts unsaid. The novice did not fear. He simply listened. And the questions, unspoken for centuries, seemed to lighten, as though finally heard. Some whispered that he became the room's keeper. Not in ink like the archivist, not in crowns or candles, but in presence alone. His gift was not to answer, but to receive. He carried doubts like a vessel, holding them gently until they dissolved into stillness. The elders began to seek him, not for counsel, but for calm. They spoke their burdens and left lighter, though he said nothing. His silence was not emptiness, but listening, a deep well where voices could rest. The novice never sought recognition. He never rose to high office, never wore robes of scarlet or rings of gold. Yet some claimed his presence was felt in every corner of the Vatican, a quiet thread binding the labyrinth together. For where others spoke, he listened, and in listening, he heard the true heartbeat of the holy city, not in proclamations, but in silence. There were those who believed he still walks the halls, unseen but near, listening always. And if you pause, in the hush of night, perhaps you will feel him beside you, the novice who asked nothing, yet heard everything. Some whispered that hidden within the archives was a cabinet bound not by locks of iron nor seals of wax, but by a single red thread. The thread was thin, almost delicate, yet no hand had ever broken it. There were those who wondered why such a fragile thing could guard what was said to be among the Vatican's most guarded secrets. Perhaps the power lay not in the thread itself, but in what it symbolized, the line between knowing and not knowing, between the safety of silence and the danger of truth. The cabinet was small, its wood dark with centuries, its corners worn smooth, as if touched by countless hesitant hands. It sat in a chamber where the air was always still, no draught daring to stir the red thread. Even the dust seemed reluctant to land upon it, as though respecting its silent authority. By candlelight, the thread glowed faintly, like a vein of fire drawn across the cabinet's face. Some said the thread had been tied there by an old pope who wished to protect not the church, but the people who served it. That he had seen truths too heavy for fragile hearts and bound them behind this veil. Others believed it was tied by a woman, a mystic, whose visions had pierced the marble of the Vatican, showing her what must never be spoken. Her thread, woven with prayer, became the guardian of silence. The archivist, with ink-blue fingers, often sat near the cabinet, but never touched the thread. He would glance at it with pale eyes, nod faintly, as one acknowledges a presence that cannot be defied. Sometimes he would whisper, though never in words, only in breath, as if reminding the thread of its solemn duty, and the flame of his candle would bend toward it, bowing like a servant before a master. Those who dared approach spoke of feeling a strange trembling in their chest. Not fear, not guilt, but a sense of standing before something both living and infinite. The thread seemed to vibrate softly, though no breeze moved. Some claimed that if you placed your ear close, you could hear faint murmurs, like the weaving of countless voices into one eternal hymn. There were whispers that the cabinet contained records of choices never revealed to the world, moments when faith and power collided, when mercy was chosen over law, when silence saved more souls than judgment could. The thread was not there to bind corruption, but to shield compassion misunderstood. If such truths were released, they would be twisted by hungry hands, turned into weapons rather than blessings. The veil of red thread was mercy itself. A few believed that those who tugged the thread would find themselves bound instead, caught in an endless weaving of memory, pulled deeper into mysteries until they dissolved into silence. For the thread was not thread at all, but the visible strand of a tapestry woven through the very fabric of the Vatican. To break it would be to unravel the pattern of centuries. So, the cabinet remains untouched, the thread unbroken. In its quiet glow, the Vatican whispers a lesson that not every truth must be revealed, not every secret needs a tongue. Some are better held gently, wrapped in silence, bound not by chains, but by a single red thread that glows like mercy in the dark. There were those who said that the bells of the Vatican carried not only sound, but fate. Their toll marked the passing of popes, the crowning of kings, the dawn of holy feasts, and the warnings of peril. Yet some whispered that there were days when the bells chose silence. No rope was pulled, no clapper struck, but still the air trembled with absence, a hush louder than any peal. It happened rarely, in moments when truth itself stood at a crossroads. A morning dawned bright, the sky clear, the city bustling, and yet the bells hung mute, as though refusing to carry words the world was not ready to hear. The people waited in the piazza, heads tilted, hearts anxious, until whispers spread like smoke. The bells have refused. Something has shifted in heaven and earth. There were those who believed the silence was a warning, that the bells, sanctified by centuries of prayer, could sense what men could not. Others said it was compassion, that the bells withheld their sound when sorrow would have shattered too many hearts. And still others believed it was defiance, that even iron and bronze grew weary of carrying lies, and so they chose to rest. The archivist wrote nothing on those days. His ink-blue fingers lay still, the quill silent upon the desk. For what could be recorded when even the bells abstained? He would sit in the quiet chamber, listening not for sound, but for the deeper hush that filled the air. Some said he saw visions in those silences, faces of the forgotten, paths not taken, mercies denied or granted. He never spoke of them, but his pale eyes grew softer each time. Pilgrims remembered those mornings for the rest of their lives. They would tell their children, "I was there when the bells did not ring," and though they could not explain what it meant, their voices trembled with reverence, as though recalling the presence of something larger than sound. In truth, the bells did not refuse. They chose. They spoke not with metal, but with silence. For there are times when no proclamation can carry the weight of mystery, when only absence can reveal the depth of truth. And so the Vatican holds those silent days in memory, not as failures, but as sacred pauses. Lessons written not in sound, but in the hush between echoes, where even heaven waits to breathe. Some whispered that in one of the Vatican's galleries, among gilded portraits of saints, there hung a frame with nothing inside. Its wood was ornate, carved with vines and angels, its gold leaf catching every flicker of candlelight. Yet where a face should have been, there was only emptiness, blank canvas, pale and waiting. Visitors often stopped before it, confused. Some crossed themselves quickly and moved on. Others lingered, tilting their heads as though an image might emerge if viewed from the right angle. But the frame remained empty, holding nothing but silence. There were those who wondered whose face it had once held. Perhaps a saint erased by history, condemned for reasons long forgotten. Perhaps a holy figure whose deeds were too strange, too troubling to display. Some believed the canvas had been painted once, but the image faded by its own will, dissolving into nothing, as if the saint wished to remain unseen. The archivist often stood before the frame, his ink-blue fingers folded in silence. He never wrote about it. He never explained. Yet when his pale eyes rested upon the empty space, they seemed to soften, as though beholding something no one else could. Some whispered that the frame was not empty at all, but full of possibility, full of the unseen saints who walked quietly through history without recognition. Mothers who prayed alone in silence, laborers who gave their bread to the hungry, children who forgave when no one taught them how. The frame, they said, was their portrait, invisible but eternal. Others believed the empty frame was a mirror, that if you stood long enough, you would see your own face flicker upon the canvas, not as you were, but as you could become, the saint hidden in every soul, waiting to be revealed. Candles burned brighter near the frame, as though eager to illuminate its mystery, and in the hush of the gallery, pilgrims sometimes wept before it, without knowing why. Perhaps they felt the weight of forgotten holiness. Perhaps they felt the invitation to step into the frame themselves. The Vatican never explained its emptiness. The curators polished the gold, replaced the candles, swept the floor, but left the canvas untouched. For some mysteries do not require answers. They require silence and reverence and the courage to stand before nothing and recognize everything. And so the frame remains, empty yet full, silent yet speaking. A reminder that sanctity is not always painted in gold or enshrined in marble. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, waiting in silence, reflected in every face that dares to look. Some whispered that the holiest words of the Vatican were not found in the lines of scripture, but in the margins. Between decrees, beside doctrines, tucked into the narrow spaces where ink bled faintly against parchment, there lingered notes no one was meant to see, soft scribbles in faded hand, hesitant marks drawn in the shadows of certainty. They called these the margins of mercy. There were those who wondered who wrote them, a weary scribe, perhaps, copying edicts late into the night, his heart unwilling to let judgment stand alone, or a priest with trembling conscience, daring to press kindness into the spaces the law had left barren. Some believed even popes at times leaned close to the parchment, their pens whispering compassion too fragile for proclamation. These notes, though brief, carried weight beyond their letters. Spare where possible. Remember the child. Mercy is greater. The archivist with the ink-blue fingers kept watch over these margins. He would unroll ancient scrolls, hold them close to the candle, and his pale eyes would soften at the sight of small, curved script tucked between bold decrees. His lips would part slightly, as though breathing a prayer. He never copied these words into official ledgers, but he remembered them, and in remembering, he gave them life. Some whispered that these marginalia carried more power than the laws they shadowed. A single soft phrase had spared prisoners, redirected wars, restored bread to the hungry. For though the edicts stood tall and heavy, it was the quiet mercy in the margins that found its way into human hands. Perhaps it was because they felt truer, less polished, less adorned, more like the voice of the soul breaking through the armor of authority. Pilgrims who glimpsed these writings by chance spoke of being struck silent. They described them as sparks of light breaking through thick stone walls, reminders that humanity pulsed even beneath crowns and robes. One woman swore she saw the words, "Forgive this time," glowing faintly in the lamplight, as though written not in ink, but in living fire. She carried the memory like a relic for the rest of her days. There were those who claimed that angels leaned close when such words were written, guiding the hand that trembled above the page, that heaven itself left fingerprints in the margins, soft reminders that divine law bends always toward compassion. And when scribes obeyed that pull, they became more than writers. They became secret keepers of mercy. The margins remain, scattered across centuries, fragile threads binding humanity to holiness. They are not taught, not displayed, not proclaimed from pulpits. They whisper only to those who pause, who look close enough to see what hides in the silence between lines. And in that whisper lies a truth the Vatican itself has long carried, that salvation is not always in the decree, but in the kindness scribbled beside it. There were those who said that somewhere within the labyrinth of marble and shadow lay a chapel unlike any other. It bore no gilded altars, no painted ceilings, no relics encased in gold. Instead, its walls were mirrors, tall, silent, and endlessly deep. They called it the Mirror Chapel, though its true name was never spoken. By day, the chapel seemed dark, its mirrors dull and clouded, reflecting little more than flickers of candlelight. But by night, when silence pressed close and the lamps burned low, the mirrors came alive. Pilgrims who found themselves within swore they saw not their own faces, but visions, faint, ghostly images that shimmered across the glass like ripples upon water. Some saw the child they once were. Others saw the person they feared becoming. Still others saw nothing at all, only darkness staring back with endless patience. There were those who wondered why such a place was kept hidden. Perhaps because it revealed too much. Perhaps because it showed not saints nor angels, but the raw and unadorned soul of the one who entered. The Vatican, in its wisdom, had learned that not every pilgrim was ready to see such truth. Only those who wandered quietly, without seeking glory, stumbled upon the chapel's door. The archivist with ink-blue fingers often walked there alone. He would stand before the mirrors, hands folded, and watch his reflection fracture into countless selves. Some nights, he saw himself as a boy, ink unmarked, eyes unburdened. Other nights, he saw a man bent with age, hands trembling beneath stains that would never fade. He never turned away. He listened to what the mirrors said without sound, and when he left, his steps seemed slower, gentler, as though each vision had carved him anew. Candles lined the floor, their flames reflected 1,000-fold, creating the illusion of endless light. Some whispered that if you walked deep enough between the mirrors, you could step out of your own reflection and into another life, one where choices had been different, where sorrow was spared, where joy endured. Others warned that such wandering was perilous, for one might lose the way back, leaving behind only a hollow reflection in the glass. The Mirror Chapel did not judge, it did not command, it simply reflected what lay hidden. And in those reflections, pilgrims found truths too intimate for confessional, too sacred for parchment. A thief once swore he saw not his crimes, but the face of the man he might have been had hunger not driven him. A priest wept before the image of a child whose forgiveness he had never sought. A queen trembled before the vision of herself without crown or veil, only a woman with tired eyes. The mirrors absorbed all these secrets without breaking. They shimmered faintly, as if whispering, "You are seen, you are known, you are still whole." And in that whisper lay their power. The chapel remains hidden, its mirrors waiting patiently. They do not fade, do not crack, do not tire of reflecting, for every soul has shadows, and every shadow longs to be seen. Some whispered of a single coin, plain and unadorned, kept in a small wooden box within the Vatican's deepest vaults. Unlike relics encrusted with jewels or crowns heavy with gold, this coin bore no grandeur. Its edges were worn, its face smooth, its metal tarnished by countless hands. And yet, it was said to have changed more lives than any treasure ever displayed in glory. The story told of a pilgrim, poor and weary, who traveled across mountains and deserts to reach the holy city. He carried nothing but a single coin, the last of his possession, clenched tightly in his palm. When he reached the gates of the Vatican, he pressed the coin into the hand of a beggar before crossing the threshold. "This is all I have," he whispered, "but it is yours." The beggar wept, not from need alone, but from the purity of the gift. For in that moment, he felt seen, honored, remembered. Some said the beggar was no beggar at all, but an angel in disguise. Others believed he was simply a man whose gratitude carried power beyond measure. Whatever the truth, the coin did not vanish. It was passed from hand to hand, each time carrying with it the weight of selfless love. Merchants refused to spend it, priests refused to keep it, soldiers refused to pocket it. Instead, they gave it onward, each one feeling its strange warmth, as though it remembered the first hand that gave it freely. The coin eventually found its way back to the Vatican, where the archivist with ink-blue fingers placed it in a simple box. He wrote no record, for none was needed. The coin spoke for itself. Some nights he opened the box, lifted the coin to the candlelight, and swore it gleamed brighter than gold. He would press it against his palm, close his eyes, and breathe, as though feeling again the pilgrim's gift echo through centuries. Visitors who by chance glimpsed the coin swore they felt their hearts shift, their burdens lighten. One man left the chamber determined to forgive an old enemy. A woman knelt in silence for hours, weeping softly, without knowing why. For the coin was not currency. It was memory, a living relic of generosity so pure it carried the weight of miracle. There were those who believed that the Vatican kept the coin not as treasure, but as compass, that in times of doubt, leaders would look upon it and remember that the church is not built upon gold or marble, but upon gifts freely given, however small. The pilgrim's coin was a reminder that mercy outweighs power, and that the smallest sacrifice, offered with love, can shift the course of heaven itself. And so the coin remains, hidden in its simple box, waiting silently. It does not demand worship, does not glitter with pride. It rests quietly, bearing the warmth of countless hands, carrying forward a truth too easily forgotten, that holiness is not found in wealth, but in the giving of what little we have, with all of our hearts. Some whispered that beneath the Vatican's foundations, far below the marble floors and echoing halls, there lay a hidden garden. It was not known by all, and those who spoke of it did so with voices lowered to a hush. A place where stone opened to earth, where roots pressed through centuries of weight, where flowers bloomed unseen in the dark. They called it the Garden Under Stone. The entrance was nothing more than a narrow stair, hidden in shadow behind an old iron grate. Few ever descended, and fewer still returned with words, for words faltered there. They bent and softened, dissolving in the presence of that silent bloom. The air below was rich, fragrant with moss and night jasmine, though no sunlight ever touched the soil. Some said the garden was lit by its own life, a faint luminescence that rose from leaves and petals, as if the plants themselves remembered the sun and chose not to forget. There were those who wondered how such a place could exist beneath a fortress of stone. The archivist with the ink-blue fingers never explained, but some swore they saw his pale eyes gleam with quiet knowing whenever the garden was mentioned. Perhaps it had been planted by ancient hands, by monks who sought refuge for their prayers. Or perhaps the garden had always been there, older than the city, older than Rome, older even than memory itself, a hidden Eden refusing to die. Pilgrims who found the garden often wept, not from sorrow, but from a sense of recognition too deep for thought. They described walking paths soft with moss, hearing the drip of hidden waters, seeing blossoms that glowed faintly like stars caught in petals. Some swore they felt hands brush against theirs, though no one walked beside them. Others claimed the flowers leaned gently toward their faces, breathing in their secrets and exhaling forgiveness. The Vatican never displayed relics from this garden, though many believed they existed. A vial of water that never spoiled, a petal that never faded, a seed that sprouted no matter where it was placed. Yet the greatest relic was the garden itself, alive in darkness, surviving against stone, reminding all who entered that life persists even when buried, that mercy blooms even under weight. Some whispered that the garden was not merely alive, but listening, that every prayer spoken in despair, every confession whispered through tears, sank through the marble above and fed the roots below. The blossoms were nourished by sorrow, transformed into fragrance, into beauty, into solace. In that sense, the garden was not hidden. It was the unseen heart of the Vatican, carrying the weight of countless souls and transmuting grief into life. The archivist sometimes descended at night, his fingers trailing against moss, his breath slowing as he entered the luminous stillness. He never carried parchment there, never ink, only silence. For in the garden, nothing needed to be written. Everything was already known. He would kneel among the blossoms, close his eyes, and let the fragrance seep into him. When he rose again, he walked lighter, as though the roots had taken his burdens into themselves. The garden under stone remains unseen by most, yet it breathes always. It does not ask for visitors, nor does it wither without them. It simply lives, in silence and in darkness, a quiet cathedral of roots and blossoms, teaching that even under the heaviest stone, life waits, listening, ready to bloom again. Some whispered of a guard whose duty was unlike any other. He did not watch the gates, nor stand before the treasures, nor patrol the courtyards. His place was in the deepest hours of night, when all else slept, and his task was not to command silence, but to sing. They called him the Keeper, and his lullaby was said to echo through the halls like a breath of peace. The song was not loud, nor even clear. It was a hum, low and steady, woven of tones older than words. Some said it was a psalm forgotten by scripture, carried through generations of guards who learned it not from books, but from breath itself. Others believed it was no song at all, but the heartbeat of the Vatican given voice, sung by the man chosen to guard its sleep. Those who heard it spoke of being calmed beyond reason. Pilgrims who tossed in restless beds felt their fears dissolve when the lullaby drifted through their windows. Priests burdened by doubt found themselves weeping softly, not knowing why, as the tune wrapped them like a mother's arms. Even the archivist, pale and ink-stained, was seen closing his eyes when the lullaby trembled through the archives. His quill stilled, his breath falling into rhythm with the song. Some whispered that the lullaby had power over more than men. They told of candles that flared brighter when the hum began, of dust that settled gently as though soothed, of locks that loosened when the melody swelled. A few claimed the song was meant not for people at all, but for the Vatican itself, for its stones and shadows, its hidden secrets, its weary marble walls, as if the keeper sang not to guard, but to comfort the ancient heart of the city. No one knew where the keeper came from. He was always there, yet no records bore his name. Perhaps he was chosen quietly, passed from one to another in the hush of night. Perhaps he was never chosen at all, but born of the silence, a voice conjured whenever the Vatican grew too heavy with its own burdens. The lullaby changed with the seasons. In winter, it was deep, like embers glowing in snow. In spring, it lifted, like blossoms opening in morning sun. In autumn, it carried a tone of farewell, gentle and tender. Yet always, it was soothing, never sharp, never hurried. It moved slowly, with patience, reminding every listener that rest was safe, that peace was near, that mercy was present even in darkness. Some swore that those who listened long enough heard words hidden within the hum, not in Latin, not in any language known, but in the language of soul. A soldier once claimed he heard his mother's voice within it. A widow said she heard her husband's laughter. A child whispered that angels were singing with the keeper, though no one else could hear them. The lullaby never ended with applause. It simply faded, leaving silence more profound than before, silence that glowed with warmth, as though the song still lingered in unseen corners. And those who heard it carried its calm within them, often for days, often for life. The keeper remains unseen by many, his voice drifting like a ghost through corridors. But those who have heard his song know that the Vatican is never truly silent. Beneath marble and shadow, it breathes with a lullaby, soft, ancient, and endlessly tender. Some whispered that within the Vatican's deepest vaults, there existed a book unlike any other. A catalogue not of saints nor relics, but of shadows. They called it the Index, and its pages were filled not with names of glory, but with records of what was hidden, avoided, or feared. It was said to contain not deeds themselves, but echoes, traces of choices made in silence, paths walked in darkness, doubts carried in secret. The index was bound in black leather, worn soft by centuries, its edges frayed like fabric. Its pages were thick, darkened by age, and the ink upon them shimmered faintly in candlelight, as though written with more than quill and dye. Some said the archivist himself tended it, though he never admitted so. Others believed the index wrote itself, each night inscribing new shadows into its body, as if silence demanded record. The entries were strange. They bore no names, no places, no dates, only fragments, whispers caught in ink, a decision unspoken, a mercy delayed, a word withheld. Some were a single line, others stretched in spirals across the page, curling like smoke. Few could make sense of them, yet all who read felt their hearts tremble, as though the shadows spoke directly to them, naming what they themselves had carried in silence. There were those who wondered why the Vatican kept such a book. Perhaps to remember that faith is not only light, but also the shadow it casts. Perhaps to guard against the arrogance of perfection, reminding that even holy halls shelter doubt. Some feared the index, believing it dangerous, for what is written of shadows might awaken them. Others revered it, believing it merciful, for what is written cannot be lost or ignored. It is acknowledged, held, and perhaps even healed. The archivist with ink-blue fingers often turned its pages slowly, never rushing, never looking away. His pale eyes would linger upon a single line, and sometimes tears welled unbidden. He did not write, but listened, as though the shadows themselves whispered their burdens through the ink. When he closed the book, he pressed his palm upon the cover, and his stained fingers glowed faintly, as though carrying away a fragment of darkness to dissolve into light. Some whispered that the index of shadows contained not only burdens of the Vatican, but of the world, that prayers left unanswered, cries unheard, grief unspoken, all found their way into its pages, as if silence itself, unwilling to let sorrow vanish, gathered it here to be remembered. In that sense, the index was not curse, but compassion. For what is acknowledged cannot be entirely lost. Pilgrims never saw the book, yet they felt its presence, heavy in the air, alive in the hush of certain chambers. And when they prayed in silence, they sometimes felt lighter, as though unseen hands had lifted their unspoken grief and set it gently upon a page where it could rest. The index remains hidden, its pages filling endlessly, a mirror of what humanity hides. It does not condemn, does not absolve, it simply remembers. And in that remembrance lies its power. For even shadows, when seen, lose the weight of fear. Even silence, when written, becomes song. Some whispered that hidden within a narrow desk in the Vatican was a drawer that opened by itself only once every century. Inside it rested not relics, not decrees, but a single letter sealed with wax the color of midnight. No hand had ever written the recipient's name, for the letter was not meant for one, but for many. The unborn, the yet to come, those who would walk long after the present had turned to dust. They called it the letter to the future. The parchment was thick, its fibers rough, as if woven from threads of time itself. The wax bore no crest, no emblem, only a faint impression of a flame. Some said the letter had been written by a pope whose eyes saw further than his years, who felt the tremor of centuries waiting like waves. Others believed it was not written by man at all, but by silence itself, inscribed in the hand of one who heard whispers not from earth, but from eternity. There were those who wondered what the letter contained. Was it a warning, carried like a lantern through darkness? Was it a blessing, folded gently for souls who would never know the hand that gave it? Some believed it contained confessions too heavy for its own age, left for a gentler time to bear. Others thought it held secrets of light, teachings that would only be understood when the world was ready. The archivist with the ink-blue fingers often sat before the drawer. He never tried to break the seal, though his pale eyes lingered upon it with reverence. Some nights he whispered softly, as though speaking to the letter itself, telling it of the world's burdens, of wars and mercies, of shadows and prayers. Perhaps he believed the parchment could listen. Perhaps he knew it was already writing itself further, with every breath of history. It was said that when the drawer stirred and opened, the air around it grew still, heavy as dawn before the first bird sang. Those present trembled, not from fear, but from awe, sensing that they stood at the edge of 2 centuries meeting in silence. The letter was never read aloud. It was carried by chosen hands into a chamber where no eyes, but a few, beheld its words. Afterward, the parchment was sealed anew, placed back into its drawer, to wait another 100 years. Some whispered that those who read it aged quickly, as though carrying centuries within their gaze. Their hair grew white, their eyes dimmed, their voices slowed. But they carried also a light, a strange calm, as if they had seen both the wound and the healing in one glance. They seldom spoke of what they had read, but their silence glowed like assurance. Others believed the letter was not fixed, but changed with each opening, that its words were fluid, written by the breath of time itself. For what future is certain, and what age does not carry its own questions? The parchment did not reveal answers carved in stone, but guidance woven in whispers, different each century, yet always the same in essence. endure, hope, love, and remember, mercy. The letter to the future remains sealed now, resting in its secret drawer. It waits without impatience, for parchment does not wither when guarded by silence. It breathes with centuries, holding what cannot yet be spoken. And those who pass near it feel the faint thrum of destiny, a reminder that the present is not an end, but a bridge, carrying words yet unopened, promises yet unseen, hope yet unborn. Some whispered of a chamber lined with shelves not of books, but of candles long extinguished, their wax pooled and hardened like frozen tears. They said this was the library of unfinished prayers, where every petition left incomplete, every prayer broken mid-breath found its place to rest. The shelves reached high into shadow, each candle marked not by name, but by the faintest etching of sound, an echo of the last words spoken before silence fell. Some prayers had been interrupted by death, others by doubt, others by despair too heavy to continue, and yet none were forgotten. The Vatican had gathered them, holding even what was incomplete, even what was left undone. There were those who wondered who had carried them there, perhaps angels, stooping gently to lift unfinished words from trembling lips, perhaps the archivist, listening in the dark, catching fragments and placing them carefully among the shelves. Or perhaps the prayers themselves had walked there, carried on their own breath, seeking a place to belong. The chamber was quiet, yet not empty. Pilgrims who stumbled upon it spoke of hearing faint whispers rising from the candles, unfinished sentences weaving together, creating a hum like wind through reeds. The sound was soft, sorrowful, yet strangely comforting, as though reminding every soul that even what we fail to finish is not lost. Some candles glowed faintly, though no flame burned upon them. These, it was said, were prayers still alive, waiting patiently to be completed. If one touched the wax, warmth pulsed through the fingers, carrying fragments of words unspoken. Pilgrims sometimes knelt there, closing their eyes, and found themselves finishing prayers begun by strangers centuries past. The words rose from their lips without effort, as though carried on a tide. And when they finished, the candle flickered, a flame appearing where none had been before. The archivist often visited this chamber. His ink-blue fingers traced the wax, his pale eyes softened by the glow of invisible flames. He never spoke, yet sometimes his shoulders trembled, as if the unfinished prayers had entered his heart, filling it with weight both unbearable and tender. He left the chamber with slower steps, carrying silence like a relic. There were those who believed the library was not sorrow, but mercy, that no prayer was ever wasted, no word ever lost. Even when voices faltered, even when despair crushed breath, heaven caught the fragments and held them here, waiting for completion. And in time, when another soul finished what had been begun, the prayer rose whole, carried upward like incense. The library of unfinished prayers remains hidden, its shelves heavy with wax, its air trembling with whispers. Yet those who have entered know its truth, that even brokenness is holy, that even silence is heard, and that every prayer, no matter how small, no matter how incomplete, has a place in eternity. Some whispered of a set of keys unlike any others, kept not in iron boxes, nor on chains, but in a simple pouch of cloth. They were old, their metal dark, their teeth strange and varied. They called them the keys that learn your hand. For these keys, it was said, did not open doors by force, but by memory. They learned the hand that held them, responding only to touch, not to strength. The pouch was passed quietly among certain keepers, entrusted not by command, but by recognition. When the archivist with ink-blue fingers received it, he did not try the keys at once. He held them gently, letting them rest in his palm. He whispered to them as one whispers to sleeping children, and in time the keys grew warm, their metal thrumming faintly as though awakening. There were those who wondered what doors they opened. Some said the keys unlocked chambers long forgotten, doors behind doors, where silence kept vigil. Others believed they did not open rooms at all, but memories, passages into the past, into the hearts of those who came before. A few whispered that the keys did not reveal secrets unless the hand that held them was ready, pure, and unafraid of what might be found. Pilgrims who touched the keys spoke of visions. One described seeing a door in her dream, which opened to reveal her childhood self, waiting with forgiveness. Another felt his heart unlock, releasing grief he had carried for decades. A third swore that when she held the keys, she heard faint voices thanking her, though no one stood near.
The keys, it was said, did not belong to the Vatican alone. They belonged to the soul. Each key recognized its holder, shaped itself to their silence, and opened what they most needed. Sometimes this was a chamber of memory, sometimes a corridor of history, sometimes only the locked door of their own heart.
The archivist never forced them. He allowed them to rest, to choose when to answer. And in his patience, they glowed faintly in the candlelight, as though acknowledging the trust placed upon them. Some whispered that when the final day comes, when the Vatican itself dissolves into dust, the keys will rise from their pouch and scatter like stars, each flying to the hand that needs it most. For they are not meant to hoard secrets, but to teach freedom. They remind us that every lock waits for its hand, every silence waits for its voice, every shadow waits for its light. And so the keys that learn your hand remain hidden, silent, warm in their pouch of cloth, waiting not for strength, not for command, but for touch, for the hand that will hold them gently, and in holding, open not just doors of stone, but doors of the soul. Some whispered of a clock kept deep within the Vatican, in a chamber where the air was thick with stillness, and where time itself seemed reluctant to pass. It was not large nor gilded, not a grand tower bell nor a jeweled device. It was simple, round, dark, and silent. Yet those who saw it never forgot, for the clock bore no hands. Its face was blank, its numbers faint as whispers, and yet it ticked, softly, steadily, as though measuring something other than hours. There were those who wondered why such a clock existed, a timekeeper that told no time, a circle that measured but never pointed. Some said it recorded not the movement of days, but the rhythm of souls, each tick a breath, each silence a heartbeat. Others believed it was the Vatican's own pulse, steady and unbroken, marking centuries with a patience no human eye could follow. The archivist with ink-blue fingers often sat before the clock, quill laid aside, listening to its sound. Tick, pause, tick, pause. A rhythm neither hurried nor slow, but eternal. His pale eyes softened as he listened, as though the sound alone carried truth too great for parchment. He sometimes rested his forehead against the cool glass, and those who glimpsed him there said he looked less burdened, as though surrendering himself to a tide far larger than ink and memory. Pilgrims who found the chamber often felt disoriented. Without hands, the clock offered no answer, no guidance, only the insistence that time existed beyond measure. Some wept, realizing how tightly they had clung to hours, to calendars, to fleeting seconds. Others laughed softly, relieved to know that eternity could not be caged by numbers. A few simply stood in silence, hearts slowing to match the clock's quiet rhythm, There were whispers that the clock had once carried hands, ornate and golden, measuring time as all clocks do. But one night, centuries ago, they vanished. Not stolen, not broken, vanished. The face was found bare, yet the ticking remained. And from that night onward, it became something more than an instrument of time. It became a teacher. Some believed the hands had not vanished at all, but slipped inward into the hearts of those who stood before it. That each person became the hands, moving through life as living markers of the eternal clock. If this were true, then the Vatican did not lose its measure of time. It spread it, weaving the rhythm of eternity into the steps of every pilgrim who listened. And so the clock remains, silent in its mystery, steady in its song. It reminds that time is not hours nor days, but the breath between heartbeats, the pause between prayers, the space between shadow and light. A clock with no hands, teaching without words, measuring without numbers, waiting patiently for all who dare to listen. Some whispered of a voice that rose in the Vatican at night, long after choirs had departed and candles had been extinguished. A single voice, soft yet vast, filling corridors with song too tender to belong to any earthly choir. They called it the Choir of One, though no one could say if it belonged to man, woman, angel, or shadow. The song was not in Latin, nor in any language known to the ear. It was made of syllables that felt more like sighs, more like the rustling of leaves, more like waves brushing against a shore. Yet those who heard it understood, not in mind, but in soul. For the song carried not words but truths, gentle reminders of mercy, forgiveness, and love deeper than silence. There were those who wondered if the voice belonged to a soul forgotten by history, a singer whose devotion had bound them to the Vatican forever. Others said it was no human voice at all, but the building itself, the marble and stone, finding song after centuries of listening to prayer. Some believed it was the echo of every hymn ever sung, condensed into a single voice that rose when all others ceased. The archivist with ink-blue fingers listened often. He never sought the source, for he knew some mysteries are diminished when pursued. Instead, he closed his pale eyes and let the sound wash over him. His quill lay still, his breath slowed, and sometimes tears streaked his cheeks, catching the candlelight like small rivers of silver. Pilgrims who by chance remained awake at the right hour sometimes heard it too. One described the song as warmth filling her chest, like a fire that did not burn but healed. Another swore he saw faint light shimmering in the air, dancing to the rhythm of the melody. A third spoke of seeing her mother's face in her dream that night, smiling as though the song had carried her spirit home. Some whispered that the Choir of One was not meant for the Vatican alone, but for the world, that its sound slipped through cracks in marble and stone, traveling into the night, entering dreams, calming storms, softening hearts across distances unseen. And perhaps it did. For there were nights when cities far away grew strangely quiet, when soldiers lowered weapons, when children slept without fear. The song never lasted long. It rose like dawn, gentle and gradual, swelling to a tender fullness before fading softly, like mist dissolving into morning light. When silence returned, it felt different, richer, more alive, as though the air itself carried memory of the music. And so the Choir of One remains, unseen, unheard by most, yet eternal in its rising. A single voice, vast as the sea, tender as a lullaby, reminding all who listen that even in solitude, song endures. Some whispered that the Vatican held a path unseen by maps, a pilgrimage not of roads or shrines, but of silence. It began nowhere and ended nowhere, for it was not measured in distance, but in stillness. They called it the pilgrimage of silence, and those who walked it were never the same. The path was not marked by stones or signs. It wound through hidden corridors, quiet gardens, narrow stairways, chambers where shadows thickened. It asked no offering but listening, no labor but patience. Each step deeper into the Vatican silence felt like a step into one's own soul, peeling away noise, thought, and fear. Pilgrims who stumbled upon this path spoke of walking for hours without knowing where they were led. They described hearing the echo of their own breath against marble, the faint hum of dust rising like stars in the air, the gentle pulse of silence alive around them. Some said the silence grew heavy at first, pressing upon their chests, frightening in its vastness. But as they continued, it lightened, unfolding like a great cloak, wrapping them in peace. There were those who never finished. They turned back, unable to bear the weight of hearing themselves so clearly. But those who endured found that silence transformed. It became not absence but presence, not emptiness but fullness. They felt seen, held, known, as though the silence itself had become a companion. The archivist with ink-blue fingers was said to walk the path often. He did not carry quill or parchment, for silence cannot be recorded. He carried only his breath, slow and steady, matching the rhythm of the halls. His pale eyes softened as he walked, as though each step erased a burden. Each pause deepened his peace. Some whispered that the pilgrimage did not end in any chamber, but in the heart itself. That after walking long enough, a pilgrim would suddenly stop, realizing the path had dissolved, and they were standing still within themselves. The Vatican fell away, the marble vanished, and what remained was pure silence. Eternal, infinite, unbreakable. And when they returned, they carried that silence with them. Their voices grew softer, their steps gentler, their presence calmer. They became like walking sanctuaries, radiating peace into every space. People around them felt it too, sensing in their company the hush of something holy. The pilgrimage of silence is not recorded in guidebooks. It cannot be planned, cannot be demanded. It reveals itself only to those who surrender, who walk not with haste, but with reverence. And even when the path ends, it continues. For once, silence has been found. It never truly leaves. And so the Vatican holds this hidden journey, unseen by most, yet waiting for all. A pilgrimage, not of distance, but of depth. Not of shrines, but of stillness. Not of maps, but of soul. The pilgrimage of silence, eternal and unbroken, whispering that the holiest journey is always the one that leads inward. Some whispered that within the Vatican there was a door that no hand could open in darkness. It was tall, framed in iron, its wood heavy with the weight of centuries. Yet at night it remained immovable, no matter how many shoulders pressed against it, no matter how many keys scraped its lock. Only when the first breath of dawn touched its face did it yield, sighing as though stone itself exhaled. They called it the door that waits for dawn. The door stood at the end of a long corridor, where shadows thickened and the air grew cool. By candlelight, it appeared almost ordinary, save for a faint glow in the grain of its wood. Those who lingered before it in the small hours spoke of feeling watched, as though the door itself listened to their silence. The archivist with ink-blue fingers often paused there, his pale eyes resting on its surface. He never pushed, never knocked. He only waited, and then walked away, trusting that the door would open when morning came. There were those who believed the door guarded a chamber of treasures, ancient scrolls, forgotten relics, secrets hidden from kings. Others thought it led not to rooms but to revelations, visions that could only be seen in the light of sunrise. A few whispered that behind it was nothing at all, only emptiness, and that the door's miracle was not what it hid, but what it taught, patience. Pilgrims who stood before it often wept, not from fear, but from the strange tenderness of its refusal. For in the stillness of night, the door reminded them of all they had sought too soon, all they had pressed for with restless hearts. Its silence spoke of seasons, of ripening, of the wisdom of waiting. And when dawn came, soft, golden, inevitable, the hinges stirred and the door swung inward with no resistance at all. Those who entered described chambers glowing with light that felt alive. Some saw shelves of books they could not read, yet whose presence filled them with peace. Others saw empty rooms that somehow felt complete, as though absence itself was sacred. A few swore they saw figures moving in the light, gentle shapes that bowed their heads and dissolved when approached. No two saw the same. And perhaps that was the secret, that the door did not lead to one chamber, but to many, each shaped by the soul that entered. In darkness, it refused. In dawn, it gave. And in its giving, it revealed not hidden treasures, but hidden hearts. The door that waits for dawn remains, silent at night, patient through centuries. It does not hurry, does not yield to demand. It simply waits, teaching all who approach that what is meant will come in its own time, in its own light, in its own dawn. Some whispered of a book bound not in leather, but in silence itself. They said its pages were blank, white as snow, yet filled with words invisible to the eye. The Book of Breath, they called it, for it was said to write not with ink, but with the exhalations of every soul who prayed within the Vatican's walls. The book rested upon a pedestal of stone, deep in a chamber where no candle burned, and yet it glowed faintly, as though lit from within. Each time a pilgrim entered, the air seemed to thrum softly, and when they breathed, whether with sighs of sorrow, whispers of hope, or laughter trembling in relief, the book stirred. Its pages rustled though no hand touched them, as if recording breath upon breath, weaving them into eternal script. There were those who wondered if the book spoke when opened. The archivist with ink-blue fingers had turned its pages, his pale eyes scanning the emptiness, and yet tears slid down his cheeks. Perhaps he read words unseen. Perhaps he heard voices written not in letters, but in the rhythm of breath. When he closed the book, he pressed his forehead to its cover, as though listening to a heartbeat too vast for ears. Pilgrims who dared to touch it often felt warmth ripple through their chests. One woman swore she heard her grandmother's lullaby rise from its pages. A soldier claimed he felt the breath of his fallen companions stirring around him. A child placed his tiny hands upon the cover and laughed, saying the book was tickling him. Some believed the Book of Breath contained not prayers alone, but life itself. Every inhale, every exhale offered in devotion, every gasp of awe beneath painted ceilings, every trembling sigh before marble altars, all were gathered, written, remembered. And so the Vatican breathed not only with stone and shadow, but with countless souls whose lives had brushed against its silence. The book never filled, though centuries passed. Its pages remained endless, white and ready, patient as eternity. Some whispered that when the final breath of the final pilgrim is given, the book will close, and in its closing, the world itself will sigh into silence. But until that day, it remains open, waiting, gathering, writing what cannot be spoken. The Book of Breath is not displayed, not proclaimed, not explained. It simply rests, glowing softly in its hidden chamber, a reminder that holiness is not always in words, but in the quiet rhythm of breathing, in the tender miracle of being alive. Some whispered that when the Vatican itself falls silent, when marble crumbles and candles burn no more, there will remain a single light. Not a lamp of oil, not a flame of wax, but a light born of centuries, carried in the silence of prayers, in the songs of choirs, in the whispers of secrets never spoken. They called it the last light. No one knew where it rested. Some said in the highest dome, where sunlight first breaks. Others said deep beneath stone, in the hidden garden that blooms in darkness. A few believed it was not in any place at all, but in every heart that ever bent in prayer within those walls. For the last light was not flame, but presence, not fire, but memory. The archivist with ink-blue fingers was said to guard it, though none ever saw him touch it. He sat in shadow, pale eyes softened, as though gazing upon something too bright for sight. Some whispered he had carried the light in his chest for centuries, that it glowed through his veins, staining his fingers with the blue of eternity. Others believed he was only its witness, waiting quietly until the day when the Vatican's final silence would reveal it to all. Pilgrims spoke of glimpsing the light in fleeting moments. A candle that burned too brightly, a reflection on marble that lingered too long, a glow upon the face of a stranger who smiled at them. They wept without knowing why, feeling themselves seen, forgiven, held. Perhaps those were fragments of the last light, spilling gently into the world so no soul would despair. Some said the last light was not meant to remain hidden forever, that when all else fades, it will rise, filling the sky, not as destruction, but as dawn. A dawn not of one city, but of all, not of one faith, but of every soul that ever sought mercy. Its glow will dissolve shadow, its warmth will end silence, and the world will rest in a peace too vast for words. Until then, the Vatican waits. Its marble breathes, its shadows listen, its mysteries remain folded in silence. And within them, always, glows the last light. Not extinguished, not diminished, not forgotten, patient, eternal, merciful, waiting for the moment when all doors open, all clocks stop, all voices join in one final hymn of silence. And in that hymn, the last light will shine, and in its shining, the world will finally rest. Some whispered that within the Vatican there was a chamber where names no longer spoken lingered like incense. A hall lined not with gold nor marble, but with shadows that murmured faintly when one entered. They called it the Chamber of Forgotten Names, though those who found it said it was not truly forgotten at all, for within its silence, every name still lived. The chamber was dim, its walls carved with faint etchings that blurred when the eyes tried to follow them. The air was cool, smelling faintly of dust and wax, though no candles burned there. A hush deeper than ordinary silence wrapped the room, heavy, patient, alive. Those who dared to step across its threshold described hearing faint whispers, soft as breath, as though countless voices spoke in unison, not to be heard, but to be remembered. There were those who wondered whose names filled the chamber. Perhaps martyrs erased from history by fear, or heretics condemned to shadow, though their faith burned true. Perhaps servants who lived and died without recognition, their hands carrying stone, their prayers unseen. Or perhaps even popes and kings, their names carved in glory above, yet surrendered here in humility, so that eternity might know them not for power, but for being. The archivist with ink-blue fingers often sat within the chamber. He never traced the walls, never wrote upon parchment, but simply listened. His pale eyes softened, as though he could see each name rise from stone, shimmering like breath in winter air. Sometimes tears welled, though his lips curved faintly, as if relieved that nothing was truly lost. Pilgrims who stumbled upon the chamber often found themselves whispering without knowing why. They spoke names of parents, children, friends, even strangers whose faces they barely remembered. And when the names left their lips, the air trembled, as though welcoming them into the eternal company. Some swore the chamber whispered their names back, carrying them softly into the silence. There were whispers that the chamber was not memory alone, but mercy, that every soul, no matter how hidden, no matter how erased, was held there, inscribed not in stone, but in silence. And when the end of days comes, the chamber will open, and every name will rise like light, shining once more across eternity. The chamber of forgotten names remains quiet, hidden, patient. It asks for nothing, promises nothing. It simply holds, remembers, breathes. And in its stillness lies a truth, that no soul is ever forgotten, for every name, once spoken, echoes forever in silence. Some whispered that in the depths of the archives lay a quill unlike any other. It was not fashioned by human hands, nor plucked from any earthly bird. They said it was an angel's quill, left behind in a moment of mystery, its feather pale as dawn, its tip glowing faintly like embered gold. The quill rested in a glass case, though no lock bound it, and yet few dared to touch it. For it was said the quill did not write what one wished, but what one truly was. Those who held it found their secrets spilling onto parchment, their unspoken truths inked without choice. Some trembled at its honesty, others wept in relief, and a few fled in fear, leaving behind words they had never dared admit aloud. The archivist with ink-blue fingers was said to be its keeper. He never used it for records of kings or popes, nor for decrees or doctrine. He used it only for silence. Sometimes at night, he lifted the quill, dipped it into no ink at all, and placed it upon blank parchment. And yet words appeared, faint, shimmering, alive. Not his own, but those of the unseen. Prayers carried by breath, confessions whispered into pillows, sighs of souls long gone. All spilled across the page in a script no human could replicate. Pilgrims who were shown the quill, rarely and only by mercy, often asked to write. Some touched it lightly and saw their doubts written. Others pressed firmly and found their grief pouring forth. A child once held it and laughed, for the quill drew shapes of stars and flowers, as though revealing the joy she carried. There were those who believed the quill was not meant for record, but for healing. That by writing truth, truth unfiltered, unhidden, souls were freed. The weight of silence dissolved, the burden of secrecy lifted. For when one's true words are written, heaven itself bears witness, and chains are broken. Some whispered that the quill never ran dry, because its ink was drawn not from wells, but from eternity. That it dipped itself in the river of all souls, writing with the very essence of life. And that one day, when all things are complete, the quill will write a final word, and in that word, the universe will rest. The angel's quill remains in silence, glowing faintly in its case, waiting patiently for the hand it recognizes. For it is not given to all. It chooses, softly, gently, and when it chooses, the soul is known in fullness, written in truth, remembered forever. Some whispered that at the heart of the Vatican burned a candle that had never been extinguished, not once, not in centuries, not through storms or wars, not even when the world outside shook with fire and despair. They called it the eternal candle, though no wax dripped, no wick withered, no flame consumed. It burned not with fire, but with presence, steady, unwavering, alive. The candle rested upon a simple altar, in a chamber bare of ornament. No gold adorned it, no jewels surrounded it, only stone, only silence, only light. Its glow was soft, not blinding, not fierce, but gentle as dawn. And yet those who saw it felt their hearts tremble, for within its flame they saw more than light. They saw themselves. There were those who swore the candle revealed not faces, but souls. One pilgrim described seeing her life unfold within the glow, every sorrow softened, every joy magnified. Another saw the faces of those he had lost, smiling as though still near. A third knelt for hours, weeping, for in the flame he saw the forgiveness he had never dared to believe possible. The archivist, with ink-blue fingers, often sat beside the candle. He never touched it, never tried to explain it. He simply rested in its glow. His pale eyes softened, his hands stilled. Sometimes he whispered softly, not words but breath, offering his silence as though it were a prayer. And the flame quivered gently, as though answering. Some believed the candle was the Vatican's heart, the reason stone still stood and song still rose. Others believed it was older than the church, older than Rome, older than time itself. A flame kindled at the birth of creation, carried through ages, hidden in shadow until it found its resting place. Pilgrims who glimpsed it never forgot. They carried its glow within them, a warmth that did not fade. Some returned to their homes with peace they had never known. Others healed old wounds, forgave ancient hurts, lived with gentleness they could not explain. For the candle did not burn only in the chamber, it burned in them. There were whispers that when the world ends, the eternal candle will not fade, that its flame will rise, filling all things, dissolving shadow and silence, that in its glow every soul will be known, every sorrow healed, every prayer answered. For the candle is not fire, but presence, not flame, but eternity. And so it burns still, quiet, patient, merciful, a single light in endless night, a reminder that beneath marble and shadow, beyond secrets and silence, there is always flame, eternal, unbroken, waiting. Some whispered that hidden beneath the Vatican's oldest stones, there was a well that no bucket could draw from. It had no rope, no wheel, no echo of iron chain, and yet it was filled, always filled, with waters that shimmered faintly like moonlight caught in liquid form. They called it the Well of Quiet Waters, for its surface was so still that one could stare for hours and see not ripples, but revelations. The stair that led to the well was narrow, carved into the bedrock itself, winding downward into silence. Those who descended often found themselves trembling before they reached the bottom, for the air grew heavy with a hush that was not absence, but presence, as though the silence itself was waiting. The archivist, with ink-blue fingers, was known to visit, his pale eyes adjusting to the dim glow as he stood over the stone lip of the well. He never bent to touch the waters. He only looked, breathing slowly, letting the surface show him what words could never describe. There were those who believed the well revealed not the future, nor the past, but the heart, as it truly was. One pilgrim swore she saw her grief dissolve upon its surface, rippling outward until only light remained. Another saw the faces of children he had never met, yet knew somehow were his, carried by memory or possibility. A soldier who had carried guilt for decades looked into the well and saw not his failures, but forgiveness rising to meet him, soft as dawn. The waters never moved, yet they changed. They reflected not the world above, but the soul within. Some said the well drank sorrow from those who looked into it, pulling tears silently into its depth, so the pilgrim could leave lighter, freer, gentler. Others claimed the well was alive, listening, breathing, transforming. Its silence was not passive. It was a voice, speaking without words, reminding each who came that they were known, wholly and tenderly, even in their darkest shadows. The archivist once whispered, so faint that only the stones heard, "These are the waters that have never risen and never fallen. They are the stillness at the beginning, and they are the stillness at the end." His fingers, stained blue with ink, rested lightly on the rim of the well, as though anchoring himself to eternity. And those who caught sight of him there felt a reverence they could not explain, as if they had glimpsed a man drinking from silence itself. The well of quiet waters remains hidden, yet it flows without ceasing. No cup can take from it, no vessel can hold it, for it was never meant to be drawn. It was meant only to be seen, to be remembered, to be trusted. And those who look into its depth carry something away without touching it at all. The knowledge that within silence there is always water, and within water there is always life. Some whispered that in a darkened vault beneath layers of stone there was kept a mask unlike any other. It was not gilded, not adorned with jewels, not carved with pomp. It was simple, blackened, fragile, made of ashes bound together by something unseen. They called it the Mask of Ashes, and no one who had worn it ever spoke of what they saw. The mask rested upon velvet, though it seemed too brittle for touch. Its shape was imperfect, as though it had been molded not for beauty, but for truth. The hollows where eyes should have been were deep, almost endless, and those who dared to peer inside felt a chill that was not cold, but recognition. The archivist, with ink-blue fingers, approached it only rarely, his pale eyes lowering with reverence each time. He never touched it, but he bowed faintly, as though acknowledging a presence too sacred for hands. There were those who said the mask was formed from the ashes of martyrs burned long ago, bound by their final breath into something that could never crumble. Others believed it was made not of bodies, but of moments. Moments of surrender, of sacrifice, of prayers whispered in fire. Whatever its origin, the mask carried weight far beyond its fragile form. Pilgrims who placed it against their faces, though few were ever allowed, spoke of visions that unraveled them. One felt every sorrow he had ever caused, flooding him like waves until he wept uncontrollably. Another saw his pride crumble into dust, leaving only humility in its place. A woman who carried hatred for decades lifted the mask and found her bitterness burn away, leaving her chest hollow and light. And yet, none were harmed. They emerged altered, quieter, softer, as though they had walked through fire and found only mercy. Some whispered that the mask was not meant for punishment but for cleansing, that ashes, symbols of death, had become instruments of rebirth. In placing the mask upon one's face, one shed all falsehood, all armor, all masks worn in life, and stood revealed in silence, naked before eternity. The terror of it was great, but greater still was the peace that followed. The archivist once murmured, "Ashes return to dust, but in the dust is the seed of dawn." And his words hung in the vault like smoke that would never fade. Perhaps that was the truth of the mask, that death itself, in all its weight and sorrow, was only the threshold of light. The mask of ashes remains untouched by most, fragile yet eternal. It teaches without speech, cleanses without flame, transforms without command. And those who dare to face it leave knowing that even in ashes there is glory, and in endings there is always beginning. Some whispered that high above the Vatican, in a chamber seldom visited, there hung a veil that glimmered faintly though no sun touched it. No moon shone upon it, no lamp lit its folds. They called it the Veil of Starlight, for it shimmered with countless tiny points of light, like a night sky woven into cloth. The veil was thin, almost transparent, yet it seemed to hold a depth as vast as the heavens. Those who stood before it often lost themselves, staring into its folds until they felt the ground vanish beneath their feet. Some swore they saw constellations moving within it, forming shapes, dissolving, reforming, as though the veil was alive, breathing with the rhythm of stars. The archivist with ink-blue fingers sometimes stood in its glow, his pale eyes lifted as though beholding something beyond the cloth. He whispered not to it, but with it, as though the veil itself was speaking through him. There were those who believed the veil was a relic of creation itself, woven from the first light that scattered when the universe was born. Others said it was a gift left by angels, spun from their wings as they descended into silence. A few whispered it was not a veil at all, but a window, an opening into the infinite sky, hidden in fabric, so the world would not tremble at its vastness. Pilgrims who touched the veil described visions of stars flowing through their veins, galaxies unfolding in their breath. One said he felt himself dissolve, becoming part of the night sky. Another claimed she saw every soul she had ever loved, shining like stars across eternity. A child pressed her face into the fabric and laughed, saying the stars were tickling her cheeks. Some whispered that the veil was not meant to reveal the heavens above, but the heavens within, that each star was a soul, each constellation a story, each shimmer a reminder that we are not separate from the sky, but woven into its fabric. To gaze upon the veil was to remember that we are not small, not lost, not alone. We are infinite, luminous, eternal. The archivist once said, "The veil does not show what lies beyond, but what already lives within." And those who heard him carried the words like stars in their pockets, glowing faintly even in the darkest nights. The veil of starlight remains suspended, shimmering softly in silence. It does not fade, does not age, does not end. It waits patiently for those who will stand before it and remember what has always been true, that within every breath, every soul, every silence, the stars are already burning. Some whispered that deep within the Vatican's hidden passages, there was a place where shadows lingered longer than their owners. Pilgrims who passed through would notice, upon turning a corner, that their shadows did not follow at once. Instead, they lingered, still against the wall, silent, watching. They called this place the Pilgrim's Shadow, and those who experienced it were never quite the same. The corridor itself was unremarkable. Narrow stone, faint candle niches, the smell of old dust heavy in the air. Yet the silence there was different. Not empty, not still, but full, as though it carried more than echoes. The archivist with ink-blue fingers was said to have walked that corridor often. He would pause at its center, tilt his pale eyes to the wall, and wait as his shadow loosened itself from his body. Those who glimpsed him said he bowed faintly to it, as though greeting a companion who had carried his burdens unseen. There were those who wondered why the shadows lingered. Some believed it was mercy, giving pilgrims a chance to see what weight they dragged behind them. For the shadows grew strange there. They did not always match the body. Some were heavier, some thinner, some hunched, some tall. They revealed the hidden shape of the soul, what guilt it carried, what hope it suppressed, what love it had yet to offer. One pilgrim swore he saw his shadow, kneeling though he himself stood. Another watched hers raise its hands toward heaven, though she had never prayed aloud. A child laughed to see her shadow dancing, spinning with joy she had not yet felt in her heart. And when they left the corridor, the shadows returned, sliding quietly back into place. But the pilgrims knew they had been seen. Some whispered that shadows here were not only mirrors, but guides, that when one left the Vatican, the shadow remained altered, lighter, freer, more whole, as though the silent wall had lifted burdens too heavy for mortal hearts. One man returned year after year to the corridor, saying each time he left with less darkness, until finally his shadow glowed faintly in sunlight, shimmering like a halo. The archivist once murmured, "We are never alone. Even our darkness walks beside us, but here it learns to kneel, it learns to pray, it learns to forgive." His fingers, stained blue, brushed the stone gently as though thanking it for keeping such secrets. The pilgrim's shadow remains, waiting quietly for those who will walk its hall. It teaches without words, comforts without touch, heals without demand. For sometimes, to be seen, even in shadow, is the holiest gift of all. Some whispered of a bell hidden high above the Vatican, tucked within a narrow tower where dust lay thick upon stone. It was cast centuries ago, vast and heavy, carved with symbols no scholar could decipher. Yet it had never rung, not once, not by hand, not by storm, not even when towers shook in war. They called it the bell that never rang, and it carried a silence greater than any sound. The bell was massive, its bronze darkened with age, its lips sharp, its rope long since rotted away. But those who stood near it swore they felt its vibration, a trembling that lived not in air, but in bone. The archivist with ink-blue fingers climbed there sometimes, his pale eyes resting upon the bell as he placed a hand against its side. He never struck it, he only listened. And when he descended, his steps were slow, his face softened as though he had heard something no one else could. There were those who believed the bell waited, that it had been forged not for the past nor the present, but for a moment still to come. When it rang, they said, the world would shift. Some thought it would mark the end of all things. Others believed it would announce not an ending but a dawn, a new world rising from silence. And so it waited, patient through centuries, carrying a voice too powerful for time. Pilgrims who stumbled upon the tower described strange sensations. One swore he heard his name whispered when he touched the bell. Another felt his heart beat in rhythm with vibrations no ear could detect. A woman fainted, later saying she had seen visions of cities bathed in light, rivers flowing upwards, stars descending to earth. The bell never moved, yet it spoke in silence to every soul who drew near. Some whispered that the bell was alive, that it chose when to reveal itself, that not all who climbed the tower found it. For some saw only dust and empty stone, but for others the bell appeared, vast and waiting, its silence humming like a secret hymn. Perhaps it was not meant for eyes, but for hearts. Perhaps its sound was already ringing, too deep for human ears, vibrating through the fabric of creation itself. The archivist once wrote, though never in public, "The bell does not wait to ring. It is ringing already, but not with sound. Its toll is silence, and silence is eternal." His ink blurred upon the page as if trembling with the truth. The bell that never rang remains still, its silence vast, its presence unbroken. It is a promise yet unfulfilled, a hymn yet unheard, a truth yet revealed. And one day, perhaps at the last breath of time, perhaps at the first breath of eternity, it will speak. And in that speaking, all shadows will bow. Some whispered of a simple wooden table hidden in a forgotten cloister where dust gathered but was never swept away. It was not carved with beauty, not polished with care. It was plain, rough, scarred by age. And yet, the dust upon it was sacred. They called it the table of dust, for it held the weight of countless hands that had rested there through centuries. The table sat beneath a cracked window where light filtered through in narrow beams. Dust lay thick across its surface, shimmering in the glow, untouched by broom or cloth. The archivist with ink-blue fingers often sat before it, his pale eyes fixed upon the motes dancing in sunlight. He traced patterns in the dust with his finger, but never wiped it clean. For each speck, he said, was a prayer, a breath, a fragment of life surrendered to time. There were those who believed the dust was not dust at all, but the gathered remnants of pilgrims' sighs, each particle a word unspoken, a grief unshared, a hope unvoiced. When they rested their hands upon the table, the dust clung to their skin, leaving faint marks like blessings. Some carried it away unknowingly, brushing it onto their clothes, their faces, their lips. And in time, their lives shifted, gentler, lighter, touched by a mystery they could not explain. One man sat at the table and wept for his lost child, his tears falling into the dust. When he rose, he felt as though his sorrow had been taken, absorbed into the surface, transfigured into silence. A woman wrote her name with her fingertip, and weeks later spoke of finding peace she had sought for decades. A boy laughed as he blew the dust into the air, and for a moment, the cloister glowed as though filled with stars. Some whispered that the table was the Vatican's most honest relic. Not gold, not marble, not jewel. Only wood, only dust, only silence. For it reminded all who sat there that we too are dust, and to dust we shall return. But within that truth was no despair, only tenderness, only humility, only the quiet beauty of knowing that even dust, when gathered in silence, can be holy. The archivist once whispered, "Dust is not the end. Dust is the beginning. For in dust, everything is carried. In dust, everything is remembered." His ink-blue fingers left trails upon the surface, but he never wiped them away. The marks faded in time, replaced by new ones, layer upon layer, history upon history, breath upon breath. The table of dust remains, plain and patient, waiting for hands to rest upon it. It is not polished, not displayed, not revered by guidebooks, but to those who know, it is sacred. For it teaches that holiness is not always in grandeur, but in what is simplest, smallest, most overlooked. Even dust, when gathered in silence, can carry eternity. Some whispered that hidden within the Vatican's oldest vaults, there was a lantern that no flame had ever kindled. Its glass was clouded, its bronze frame darkened with centuries, and yet it glowed faintly, softly, as though remembering fires that had never burned. They called it the lantern of forgotten paths, for when it was lifted, it revealed ways that no map recorded, ways that had been lost to time, yet still lingered in silence. The lantern hung from a hook, in a chamber small and square, its air thick with dust, its stone cool with age. The archivist with ink-blue fingers often visited, his pale eyes resting on the lantern as though upon an old friend. He never polished its frame, nor wiped its glass. He only reached out, and when his hand brushed its handle, a faint light bloomed, silver as moonlight, soft as dawn mist. Those who carried the lantern found themselves wandering corridors they had never known existed. Walls opened into gardens hidden beneath stone. Staircases descended into chambers where silence breathed like a living thing. Some found themselves walking paths not through the Vatican at all, but through their own memories. A pilgrim once lifted the lantern and found herself standing in her childhood home, the glow illuminating her mother's face as though she had never left. Another saw the path of his life unwalked, the choices he had not made, the loves he had not held, and he wept, not from regret, but from the strange beauty of seeing what might have been. There were those who whispered that the lantern did not create paths, but remembered them, that it gathered every step ever taken within the Vatican's walls, every prayer walked, every sorrow carried, and held them gently within its glow. When lifted, it returned those paths to sight, not to be walked again, but to be remembered. For even what is forgotten is never truly lost. It lingers, waiting, like a road in shadow. Some feared the lantern, for the paths it revealed were not always gentle. A man once lifted it and saw a road of grief he had long refused to walk. He trembled, but when he followed, the light did not abandon him. It led him through sorrow into peace, through darkness into dawn. And when he returned, his face was wet with tears, yet his heart was lighter than it had ever been. The archivist once murmured, "No path is gone. Every step remains. The lantern remembers what we forget." His blue-stained fingers closed around its handle, and the light flared briefly, illuminating his face with a glow both sorrowful and serene. The lantern of forgotten paths remains, its glow faint but eternal. It waits for hands willing to lift it, for souls willing to see what has been hidden, for hearts willing to remember. And in its remembering, it teaches the gentlest of truths, that even forgotten ways still lead home. Some whispered of a reliquary unlike any other, hidden not in gold, not in glass, but in emptiness. It was said to rest in a chamber where no relic lay, no bone, no cloth, no fragment of saintly life. Only a reliquary, plain, wooden, unadorned, containing nothing but silence. They called it the reliquary of silence, and those who opened it found themselves trembling as though they had touched eternity. The reliquary was small, no larger than a box one might carry in both hands. Its wood was dark with age, its surface worn smooth by centuries of touch. The archivist, with ink-blue fingers, often sat before it. His pale eyes lowered, his breath slowed. He never opened it hurriedly, never demanded from it. He lifted the lid gently, reverently, and when the silence within rose, he bowed his head as if before a king. There were those who believed the reliquary contained the last breath of Christ, caught upon the wind and preserved forever. Others said it held the unspoken prayers of martyrs gathered at the moment of their death. A few whispered that it contained no relic at all, but rather the very silence of God, the stillness before the first word, the hush that preceded creation. Pilgrims who witnessed it described being struck still. One said she felt her heartbeat slow until it matched the silence. Another said he heard nothing, yet that nothing was more vast than any sound he had ever known. A child who peered inside laughed softly, saying she saw stars glowing in the darkness, as though the reliquary held the sky itself. The reliquary did not change, yet it changed those who encountered it. They left speaking more softly, moving more gently, carrying silence within them like a hidden flame. For they understood that silence was not absence but presence, not emptiness but fullness. It was the reliquary of all things, holding every prayer, every sorrow, every joy in a hush too deep for words. The archivist once whispered, "Silence is the relic of all relics. It cannot be broken, cannot be burned, cannot be lost. It is what remains when all else fades." His ink-blue fingers rested on the reliquary's lid, and he closed his eyes as though surrendering himself to its stillness. The reliquary of silence remains, waiting patiently in its chamber. It contains nothing, and it contains everything. It does not glitter, does not proclaim, does not demand. It simply rests, breathing with eternity, reminding all who open it that silence itself is the holiest relic of all. Some whispered of a window high in the Vatican's walls, a window not marked on any map, not seen from outside, yet always watching. They called it the window that watches, for those who pass beneath it felt eyes upon them, gentle, patient, merciful. The window was small, framed in stone, its glass faintly clouded, shimmering with a light that seemed not of sun nor moon. By day it glowed softly, as though remembering dawn. By night it shimmered faintly, like starlight caught in crystal. The archivist with ink-blue fingers often paused below it, his pale eyes lifted as though meeting a gaze from beyond. He never spoke there, never wrote. He only stood, waiting, listening, breathing. There were those who believed the window did not open outward, but inward, that it looked not upon the world, but upon the soul. Those who stood beneath it often felt their hearts laid bare, as though the glass saw them more truly than they saw themselves. Some wept, feeling their burdens dissolve under its gaze. Others laughed softly, feeling themselves forgiven without a word. A few trembled, for they had carried shadows too long, yet even in trembling they felt no condemnation, only a watching too kind to fear. One pilgrim swore he saw the glass ripple, as though eyes blinked from within. Another claimed he saw his mother's face shining faintly, smiling as she had when alive. A child pointed upward and said she saw angels peering through, waving with hands of light. And though none else saw, the hush in the air confirmed that something, someone, was always watching. Some whispered that the window was God's own eye, placed within the Vatican to remind all who entered that they were never unseen. Others said it was the gaze of the countless faithful, the communion of saints, watching still from eternity. A few believed it was the soul's own reflection, showing itself as light when it finally dared to be seen. The archivist once murmured, "To be watched without judgment is to be healed. The window sees not what we show, but what we are, and still it shines." His ink-blue fingers pressed lightly against the wall beneath it, his breath trembling as though touched by invisible hands. The window that watches remains, hidden in stone, unseen from without, unmarked on any map. It gazes always, softly, mercifully, endlessly. And those who stand beneath it leave changed, for they know then the holiest truth of all, that to be seen is not to be condemned, but to be loved. Some whispered of a book hidden deep in the Vatican's inner sanctums, not locked in iron nor bound by chains, but resting quietly on a pedestal of stone, as though placed there by unseen hands. They called it the book that breathes, for those who drew near swore they heard the sound of breathing, slow, steady, patient, as though the book itself lived. Its cover was plain, its leather worn soft with age, its pages thick as if carved from centuries. Yet no dust ever touched it. The air around it stirred faintly, as though each page exhaled with a rhythm older than memory. The archivist with ink-blue fingers often stood beside it, his pale eyes lowered, his breath slowing until it matched the books. He never opened it hurriedly. He only waited, and when the book sighed, he would lift the cover gently, as though lifting the chest of someone sleeping. Inside, the pages bore no script at first glance. Blank, pale, endless. But those who lingered saw faint letters forming, not written in ink, but in light, shimmering softly before fading again. They were not words of doctrine nor decree, but fragments, phrases of prayers, sighs of the dying, laughter of children echoing across centuries. Some saw their own words written there, sentences they had whispered in despair years ago, rising again as though eternity had never forgotten them. There were those who feared the book, for it revealed not the polished words of ritual, but the hidden language of the heart. One man opened it and saw the anger he had buried, rising like smoke across the page. He wept, not from shame, but from the strange mercy of being known so fully. Another pilgrim opened it and found only silence, until her tears fell upon the parchment. And then the words of her lost mother formed in light, telling her she was loved still. Some whispered that the book breathed because it was bound not in leather, but in life. That every prayer ever spoken, every thought ever offered in silence, was gathered here, preserved not as record, but as presence. To open the book was not to read history, but to meet eternity. The archivist once murmured, his voice no louder than a sigh, "It does not keep words. It keeps breath, and breath is the first prayer, and the last." His blue-stained fingers lingered on the page, trembling, as though touched by an unseen hand. The book that breathes remains hidden, exhaling gently, alive in silence. It does not age, does not fade, does not end. It waits, patient as dawn, ready to show every soul not what they wish to see, but what they truly are, and in that revelation, to heal them. Some whispered of a path within the Vatican that no map revealed, a path that could only be walked in silence. They called it the path of 7 echoes, for each step taken upon it was answered not once, but 7 times, each echo carrying a different voice. The path began in shadow, beneath an arch so narrow only one could pass at a time. The air there was cool, alive with a hush that seemed to listen. Those who walked it soon noticed that their footsteps did not sound as they expected. Instead, each step resounded, not with one echo, but with 7, rolling outward like bells struck in hidden chambers. The first echo was their own voice, familiar, ordinary. The second was softer, as though spoken by a child. The third carried weight, deep as stone, as though an elder answered. The fourth was distant, like a friend calling across a river. The fifth trembled, as though in sorrow. The sixth laughed, bright and sudden. And the seventh was silence, so vast and alive it swallowed all others, filling the soul with awe. The archivist with ink-blue fingers was said to walk the path often. He placed his steps slowly, listening as the echoes unfurled. His pale eyes softened, as though he heard more than sound. He heard memory, prayer, and eternity woven together. Those who followed him said he sometimes stopped and bowed his head, as though answering voices too holy for words. Pilgrims who braved the path were changed. One swore she heard the echo of her unborn child calling her name. Another said he heard his own laughter as it would sound in heaven. A third wept, for he heard not only his sins, but their forgiveness ringing back to him with every step. Some whispered that the path of 7 echoes was not stone at all, but soul. That it led not through walls, but inward, drawing pilgrims deeper into their own being until they met the silence at its heart. That final echo, vast and endless, was said to be the voice of God, speaking not in words, but in presence, reminding all who walked that they were never alone. The archivist once whispered, "The path is not walked by feet, but by listening." And the echoes are not answers, they are mirrors. His blue-stained fingers brushed the wall gently, as though thanking it for keeping such voices safe. The path of 7 echoes remains hidden, waiting for those willing to listen more than to walk. Each step there is prayer, each echo revelation, and at its end is not an ending, but silence, holy, infinite, alive. Some whispered of a chalice kept not upon any altar, nor displayed in glass, but hidden in a small chamber where no ceremony was performed. They called it the cup that empties itself, for no matter how much was poured into it, no drop remained. The cup was simple, carved of stone, its surface rough, its edges chipped, and yet it was heavier than any gold, heavier than any jewel. The archivist with ink-blue fingers often carried it to the chamber, his pale eyes lowered as he placed water within it. But as soon as he set it down, the water vanished, absorbed, dissolved, gone without trace. He never flinched. He only bowed his head, as though acknowledging a mystery too vast to explain. Pilgrims who were permitted to see it often tested it themselves. They poured wine, and it was gone. They poured tears, and they too disappeared. Some placed their hands inside and felt nothing, only warmth, as though the cup itself was alive. And yet those who left the chamber spoke of being lighter, as though their burdens had been poured into the chalice and dissolved with the water. There were those who believed the cup drank sorrow, that it emptied not of liquid, but of grief, carrying the weight of humanity into silence. Others said it was a vessel of mercy, consuming sin, not with fire, but with tenderness. A few whispered that it was Christ's own cup, still receiving sacrifice, still offering release. One man poured into it a letter he had written to a friend long dead, and when the paper touched the stone, it dissolved into nothing. He left smiling for the first time in years. A woman dipped her fingers, whispering the name of a child she had lost, and when she withdrew her hand, she felt peace so profound it trembled through her bones. A child placed a flower in the cup, and it too vanished. But weeks later, she said she dreamed of a garden more radiant than any she had seen, where her flower bloomed eternal. The archivist once whispered, "It does not take, it releases. The emptiness is its gift." His ink-blue fingers lingered on the rim, trembling as though touched by something unseen. The cup that empties itself remains hidden, patient, merciful. It never fills, never overflows, never ends. It teaches the holiest of truths, that to empty is not to lose, but to be free. That in surrender there is peace, and that sometimes the most sacred vessel is not one that holds, but one that lets go. Some whispered that deep within the Vatican's stone veins, behind doors rarely noticed and never marked, there existed a room that held the sorrows humanity could not carry. They called it the room of unwept tears, for the walls themselves were damp with grief that no eye had shed, no voice had confessed, no heart had dared to release. The chamber was small, circular, without window or altar. Its air was heavy, fragrant with salt, as though the sea itself had been trapped within. Pilgrims who found their way there said they heard the faint sound of water dripping, though no water could be seen. The archivist, with ink-blue fingers, visited often, his pale eyes lowered as he stood in silence. Sometimes he lifted his hand to the wall, and when he drew it back, his fingertips were wet. as though the stones themselves wept. There were those who believed that every tear uncried in the world, every grief stifled, every sorrow swallowed, every pain hidden, found its way to this room, not as flood, but as mist, seeping into stone, held tenderly, so no soul need drown in what it could not release. Others whispered that angels carried the unwept tears here, gathering them like fragile pearls to preserve their sanctity. For even tears, unshed, are holy and must not be forgotten. Pilgrims who lingered in the room sometimes found themselves weeping for the first time in years. One man who had lost his family in war fell to his knees and sobbed until his chest ached, saying the walls had given him permission at last. A woman who had carried her silence for decades laid her palm against the stone and felt the tears of countless others rushing through her, cleansing her, softening her. A child who entered with her parents began to cry without knowing why, her tears pure and innocent, as though she wept on behalf of all who could not. The archivist once whispered, "The stones remember what we forget. They carry what we cannot." His blue-stained fingers pressed gently against the wall, trembling as though touched from within. He left with damp palms, but lighter steps, as though his own burdens had dissolved into the weeping stone. The room of unwept tears remains hidden, its walls heavy with sorrows untold. Yet those who enter find that grief does not crush here. It heals. For the room teaches that tears unwept are not lost. They are preserved, sanctified, waiting for the moment when they can finally flow, and in flowing, release the soul into peace. Some whispered of a place even deeper than the libraries, where shelves did not hold books, nor scrolls, nor parchment, but shadows. They called it the Archive of Shadows, and those who glimpsed it spoke in hushed voices. For what was kept, there was not words, but the imprints of everything unspoken. The archive stretched vast and narrow, its shelves carved from stone, its air dim with a light that seemed to rise from the shadows themselves. Each shelf was lined not with volumes, but with faint shapes, like smoke made solid, trembling faintly as though alive. The archivist with ink-blue fingers was said to know the paths there better than anyone. He walked slowly, his pale eyes tracing the trembling forms, his hands folded as though in prayer. He never touched the shadows, he only listened, for they whispered softly, voices too faint for any ear but his. There were those who believed the shadows were confessions never spoken, truths carried in silence to the grave. Others said they were thoughts so heavy they could not be borne by words, left behind like echoes when the soul departed. A few whispered that the shadows were not human at all, but fragments of eternity itself, clothed in silence, so that mortals would not be blinded by their light. Pilgrims who stumbled upon the archive often fled, unnerved by the weight of what they saw. Yet some stayed, drawn by the strange mercy of the place. One man saw a shadow tremble before him, and as he gazed, he realized it carried his father's regret, never spoken in life. He wept, and in his weeping, the shadow dissolved into light. A woman stood before a shape that mirrored her own outline, carrying the words she had never dared to say. She whispered them softly, and the shadow brightened until it vanished. The archivist once murmured, "Shadows are not absence. They are memory waiting to be seen." His ink-blue fingers brushed the shelf gently, and the shadows stirred as though sighing in relief. For even what is unspoken longs to be acknowledged. Even silence desires to be heard. The archive of shadows remains, vast and trembling, filled with voices that never rose. It does not condemn, does not judge, does not accuse. It simply holds, patiently, until each shadow is met with recognition, and in that recognition, dissolves. For the archive teaches that even the darkest silence carries light, waiting only to be seen.